Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to day 4 of the Illinois Environmental Health Association's Spring Virtual Conference. Happy St. Patty's Day to everybody. And we will go ahead and start in. Don't forget to put your email in the chat box. The CEU forms are available on our website. If you do have any questions, just feel free to reach out. Hope everyone enjoys the conference.
Thank you, Justin. I'd like to go ahead and introduce our first speaker, Derek Deland, on refrigeration testing and possible impacts on plan review. I'll now turn it over to Derek.
Okay, thank you, Rachel. I'm gonna first do a volume check. Can you hear me all right?
Yes, we can hear you.
Okay, so now we will venture into sharing screens. Come on, how are we with that?
Perfect.
Wonderful. Okay. I've given this presentation before to a variety of groups. Just maybe a little introduction to myself. I work in NSF's Regulatory Affairs Department. Being a former regulator myself with the health department in Michigan as an inspector and EH director for a while. They hired me to kind of be the point of contact for state and local regulators. And so this is one that I know came up quite a bit for me when I was, in the field and doing plan reviews. And as I went around the country and talked to a few folks about how are we testing these refrigeration units? What are those kind of label limitations on the inside of the units mean? And so I decided to kind of develop this presentation to give a background on some of that, as well as kind of the impacts that it can have, certainly for plan review and things of that nature. So I guess with that, we'll kind of dive in. For an agenda here, just real quickly, I will kind of touch on who NSF is for those of you that may not be familiar with us, and then kind of do an overview of the standards and certification and how we do things. And then we'll dive in a little deeper into some specific standards and the refrigeration testing, that type of thing. So NSF was actually founded in 1944 out of the University of Michigan School of Public Health. It actually started with a health inspector, the director of the Toledo, Ohio Health Department, started grad school at the university's School of Public Health. And during that time, they started to have a lot of conversations with the folks there about the lack of standardization with food equipment, right? A lot of people were going out to eat out of the Depression era. There were uneven regulations, lots of foodborne illness and so on. So there was this desire to kind of level set things and kind of, set the bar for where food equipment was originally where it started, should be. And of course, since then, now 75 plus years later, we've continued to grow into doing a lot of things related to standards and certification of food equipment and a lot of other things. But our relationship with the School of Public Health and with health department folks in general is still something that is very ingrained with everything we do. I guess I'll throw that up there. I guess I'm speaking with folks in Big Ten country, so I'll try not to be distracted by the game that's actually going on right now that Michigan's in, and good luck to any Illini fans and Rambler fans out there as well. But we'll stick to food equipment now and stay away from basketball. So where we're at now, we are a global independent not-for-profit organization, and the mission is shared with you folks, right? It's protecting and improving human health. And the way it works largely in the space is developing standards and doing certification testing for those core programs. So it's food equipment, on-site wastewater, everything related to drinking water, really from chemicals to water contact materials and so on. And then, of course, pool and other rec water equipment, things of that nature. So a little bit about the kind of standards themselves and certifications. I wondered before I came over here to work, who is NSF and why do they get to make all of these standards? Who are they to be the arbiters of good public health and so on? Well, come to find out, we do not actually write the standards. We are the stewards of the standards. We file them, we own them, we make sure they go through the national consensus process so that they're ANSI standards. but they're really written by these three groups of folks here. I kind of call this our three-legged stool, right? You need at least 3 legs on a stool for it to be able to work. So it's the manufacturers, the end users, which would be purchasers and stuff, and then regulators, which is you folks. And you all are fundamental to everything that NSF does. Without the regulatory input on our standards, they wouldn't hold any weight. They wouldn't be as useful. So, you know, we encourage certainly your participation in them, your acceptance of them, your adoption of them, all of those type of things, because it's really an important piece to, I guess, public health and in our mission. Just a real quick pitch. If anybody ever wants to get involved with standards, wants to be on one of those regulatory groups, whether it's on the actual joint committees or maybe as part of a task group, there are ways to get involved. I'm not going to go through all these things, but feel free to reach out for me. My contact information will be, I think, here at the end of these slides, or else I'm sure you can get it otherwise from Rachel or somebody else, or you can reach out to the standards group, but we always encourage your involvement. So moving on now to standards. So what is in a standard? By and large, all of our standards, but in particular, certainly the food equipment ones, kind of have 3 pieces, right? There's the general hygienic design component, there's the safe materials component, and then there's the performance component. And depending on the type of equipment, you know, it might be, like we'll get into the refrigeration performance things today, but there might be, you know, certainly dish machines have performance requirements on their sanitization and all of these type of things, right? So here are the 21 food equipment standards. What is highlighted in green are the ones that I'm going to specifically talk about today. And if you look, specifically standard 2 is really centers a lot around the hygienic design stuff that I was talking about. Standard 51, which is the materials, is the other element I talk about. And then when you get into standard 7, which is specifically for refrigeration, it does incorporate standard 2 and 51 by reference, and then it has its own certain criteria and its own performance criteria, which I was talking about. And then all of these standards are available for anybody that wants copies. They are free to regulators. You can reach out to me. I will get you copies of those for your own reference or use. And the one thing I would note with all these is if you see down the bottom, standard 170 is a glossary. So if you get any of these, I would recommend make sure you get 170 as well, because that's where all of the, you know, the definitions will be. So rather than having to update them in every single standard when a definition changes or something new is added, we just keep them housed in one standard. But these are available to you folks anytime you would need them. Real quickly on certification, right? So we have the standards, which has all the criteria for the testing and so on. Then we have the certification, which is the actual testing of the products for conformance to the standards criteria. Not going to go through this whole entire list here. You guys can read it, but the things that I wanted to point out beyond, you know, we do all the document review and all these type of things is kind of step 3 and step 6 there, where before we do any actual certification, we do an audit of the manufacturing facilities to make sure that what they are mass producing is exactly what we are testing. We don't want somebody to, you know, ship us the Rolls Royce and we test it and it passes, and then we end up going to the facility and they're pumping out Yugos or AMC Pacers or something like that, right? So we need to be sure that what they're mass producing is exactly what we've tested and certified. And then they're not done. Every year after that, we will do unannounced annual audits to make sure that what they're producing is still the same, engineering specs are the same, the material suppliers are the same, all of those type of things. So it's an ongoing process, certainly not a one and done situation. Quickly here on the food code, I don't think probably much of this is lost on any of you folks, certainly the ones that are working in the food end of things. But in the latest edition of the food code, it is now written in there that for the automatic acceptance under the certification, that the equipment has to be certified to the recognized American national standards. Previously, it said something like just certified for sanitation, but it didn't really say to what standard. Now it clearly says in there the American national standards, which are the NSF standards. The NSF ANSI standards is what we're talking about here. Now, not this certainly stops short of saying every piece of equipment, of course, has to be certified. But what it's saying is if it's certified, it gets automatic acceptance. Some states have gone through and changed their codes to require certified equipment regardless. In some states that haven't changed their state code, there are local ordinances where they require certified food equipment to go into their facility so they don't mess with non-certified stuff. For example, the state of Texas, I know, does not have it in their state code, but there's at least a dozen or more local municipalities, cities, or counties that have put it into their own ordinance to require certified equipment. Because of course they see the benefit to it. The whole point to it is to take some of that heavy lifting and risk and some of those things off of health departments and put them on to the manufacturers and the certifiers. So a couple of points to ponder here along those same lines. If we have a code, right, why do we need these standards? Why do we use them? What is the benefit? Well, I think, I kind of mentioned it at our outset of why NSF was even founded, right? It's to kind of level set everything and get uniformity, but it's also this clear pass fail criteria, really those top 2 points, and the level of detail, which isn't in anybody's food code that I've ever seen, right? It says food equipment needs to be easily cleanable. What does that mean? How is that defined? How is that measured? And there's really no guidance for that, right? So it becomes a little bit subjective and a little bit problematic. Because I'm sure you have all heard, I know I did in my day, well, they let me do it over in Indiana, that's approved there. And then you have to explain, well, you're not in Indiana, you're in Illinois, and here we're not going to allow it. Or, and you get that even from county to county, or heck, even within a health department, you'll get, inspectors or plan reviewers that may disagree on something. So it is that clear pass fail criteria that everybody has to be measured against that helps kind of take that burden off of the health departments. Going to the second bullet here is kind of along those same lines, right? Is your code clearly defined what is desired in a piece of food equipment? And as I said before, it's not. It doesn't really talk about how you would define what is easily cleanable and so on. I've heard periodically people tell me, well, we don't allow residential pieces, but we require it to be commercial grade. And my question always is to them then, well, still, what does that mean? How are you measuring that? Is it because it's kind of boxy looking and kind of seems like it's made out of stainless steel and so on? So, okay, I guess we'll call it commercial grade, right? Or is it just a manufacturer self-claim? The main thing, I guess, where I'm getting at is the only real criteria that I've seen, the American National Standard, the ANSI standard, the anti-NSF standard for commercial refrigerator, for example, is NSF 7, which we're talking about today. So to me, if you're talking about commercial, the American standard for commercial refrigeration, it's going to be your NSF stuff. And then lastly, do health departments actually verify 4.1 and 4.2, which is your materials and your easily cleanable, your hygienic design? And if so, how do they do it? And my answer to this is health departments are not doing this. Overwhelmingly, they are not. And that's not to impugn any health departments or any plan reviewers and how they do things, because I was one and I did this myself, right? So I know this happens. I talked to a lot of other people across the country, because I was former regulator, whatever, don't have the time to really drill into a lot of the detail on some of these pieces of food equipment. Further, if you're trying to look at it, how are you really judging cleanability or materials just off of a spec sheet, right? And so that's the problematic piece, where then pieces could go in and have perhaps poor design, unsafe materials, and there's no way that they've been vetted, putting, I think, health departments and in some degree the public health at risk. So with that in mind, that's why we always encourage, I think it's good public health practice to rely on the certifications to make sure that the health departments are kind of cleared of any of that liability, because there's just so much you can't look at while you're trying to cram all these things in and get them done in a certain timeline dictated by law, when the builder and everybody else is beating down your door wanting their approvals to construct and so on. But I think it's important to acknowledge here what we're talking about. We're not talking, there's certain, kind of pieces of equipment that are very obvious. Some of them not so much. So, how are we looking at imported espresso machines from Bolivia or something, or juice machines? So we know that the water lines in there don't impart lead or don't have plastics that are imparting harmful chemicals. Health departments just don't have the capacity to look at those materials and figure those type of things out, even though technically it's required under the code. So again, what we're not talking about, are the obvious ones, things like this. right? I mean, nobody's approving this piece of equipment as novel of an idea as this is. These aren't the things that are going in, and this would not meet the NSF standard for a refrigerator. Nor would we approve the universal shopping cart grill, right? These are, of course, meant to be ridiculous. No health department is going to approve these to go into a restaurant or anything like that. But where I'm going with it is does speak to what I was speaking before about maybe certain imported pieces or even domestic, doesn't really matter. If you're only seeing it on a spec sheet, you're not getting material reviews. You couldn't even probably know how to review a lot of the plastics that go in, so on and so forth. It makes it very difficult to determine what really should and shouldn't be allowed. And I think sets health departments up for a level of risk and liability there. So moving on then, let's get into a little bit more of the teeth on some of these standards. Starting with standard 2, and these are kind of 10,000 foot view of what's in these criteria. They drill down, of course, much deeper and in much other layers of complexity. But I want to touch on some main points, specifically as it relates to refrigeration. And you'll see as we get toward the end, kind of how these things all work together to kind of differentiate some certain pieces. So a few definitions that we need to go through first. A food zone is essentially what health department folks call a food contact surface. You have the direct food contact surfaces are obvious, but then you see like in your flip top prep units, like the underside of the lid where you might get condensation that could drip down onto the food, that is also considered a food zone. And as you can imagine, the criteria for food zone, the safety measures are much higher than, much more stringent than they are for the other zones. And speaking of those other zones, so a splash zone, I think the definition is pretty self-explanatory, right? It's somewhere where you're going to get potential food splash. So we have cleanability issues, some of those type of things, but not necessarily a direct food contact risk or anything like that. And then the last one is a non-food zone, which are like underneath equipment, the bottom side, stuff like that, where yes, you have cleanability things going on, but they're relatively minor. It's going to be kind of dust buildup and so on. But there are other criteria that are in there that make sure that, seams are closed and things of that nature. So there's no, vermin harborage or things like that. So when it comes to the hygienic design of things, one of the main things that comes up quite often is the radius requirements, right? When we're looking at a two-plane intersection, whether it's in a 3-compartment sink or it's in a pan or whatever the case is. And what the standards say, what standard 2 says is if you have a 2-plane intersection, it has to be at a 135-degree angle or a minimum of a 1/8 inch rounded radius, as you can kind of see in those pictures there. And what we're talking about here, again, clear, measurable, pass, fail criteria, right? There's no ambiguity about it. It's in or it's out. And it makes it a lot easier to not only perform the evaluations, but to have the assurity that you're doing your best you can to make sure that you've got cleanable surfaces and protecting public health here. And then again, same concept, at a 3-plane intersection or a corner, you have to have at least a 1/4 inch radius. And again, this is all about cleanability, so you don't get food deposits and debris kind of crunched into those 90-degree angles and you can't get it out. The other thing that is a common differentiator are fasteners. So first of all, fasteners in general, period, are not allowed in a food zone. Doesn't matter what type of fastener they are, but easily cleanable fasteners are allowed in the other 2 zones. And these are just kind of some examples of what an easily cleanable fastener looks like. The thing on the right there is supposed to be those pop rivets that actually have just a little shallow dimple that you can clean out. Not like what you see here in the upper left, where it's these pop rivets that have the open holes in these deeper openings. These are unacceptable, as are all the rest of these. So these could be used in any part of a food equipment. I think for obvious reasons, right? You got, the potential for food to get trapped in there or difficulty in cleaning it out, certainly. So this just kind of gives a quick table overview of some of the things I just talked about, as well as a few other pieces. But you can see, I feel so different not presenting in person with a laser pointer here, but the radius requirements and the fasteners, right? You see the food zone where the radius is required, not in the others, and the fasteners that are not permitted, but easily cleanable are in the other. Those are really two of the big differentiators between what is allowed in certain food areas, what is allowed for exposed food, what is not, and so on. And like I said, we'll get into some of that detail here in a little bit. But this just kind of gives you a general idea of what these requirements look like for these different zones. So now transitioning a little bit to standard 51, a little bit on the materials. Not a whole lot of detail going into these slides, but enough to kind of give you the point here. So direct food contact materials need to either be already previously certified to NSF 51. So it's something that we've already seen. We've vetted it out. We know the material is safe, so on and so forth. Or if it is a novel material, which most of the time now we see that with maybe different plastics and maybe sometimes some metals, but usually plastics. We'll do a full formulation review with our toxicology department. So if there's very I guess different, who knows what it is, different chemical compounds in there, they will look at this, they'll look at the whole chemical formulation that they get from the manufacturer, from the supplier, to break down and find out, is this something that has, could it possibly, leach into food product? And then B, if it does, is it harmful? At what levels? What are we talking about? What is the risk to this type of thing, right? This is the kind of detail I'm talking about with materials that frankly, health departments, there's just no way they have the time, the bandwidth, or the personnel on staff to even try to handle something like this. Lead, arsenic, cadmium, these heavy metals are prohibitive, of course, as intentional ingredients. So the types of alloys that we have for aluminum, stainless steel, those kind of stuff are the only ones that are allowed, are the ones that prohibit these as components to them to begin with. I previously, interestingly enough, when I first started working here, I thought kind of a lot of the stainless steels were all the same. It wasn't until I got here and realized there's quite a bit of difference between the different grades of stainless steel. And the only ones that we allow, I think, have to have like a 16% chromium content, which has to do with the corrosion inhibition, corrosion control to it. So if you see some stainless steel in certain spots that is, especially maybe a non-certified equipment that is rusting, or certainly rusting prematurely, it may be a lesser grade of stainless steel and something else is going on. Requirements here, again, just another summary slide similar to the other one I showed for the hygienic design, right? The main differentiator here, you can look through this whole thing, right? There's only one box that's different, and that's the food zone and the toxicity issue, right? All the rest of them, we meet with the same criteria, but the differentiator again. So now we go back to the food zone, right? What we talked about? We talked about non-toxic materials. We talked about the radius requirements. And we talked about the fastener issues, right? Those are really going to be some of the differentiators that separate certain pieces of equipment from one another. So now transitioning a little more directly into refrigerators. And I've given you kind of a general overview of our kind of hygienic design related things and our materials related things. Sorry, just hydrating. So as far as the type of refrigerators go and freezers, you see this whole list here. I certainly don't need to read through this list for you. But what this is saying, what this is getting at is nowadays, refrigeration in particular has become very specialized in some sense. It's not a one size fits all type thing anymore. And because manufacturers and end users are looking for very specific uses for these type of things, of course, then the standards, the testing behind them, so on and so forth, fell in line with that, right? To match what the intended use is for these specific products. And it can get, really almost sometimes absurdly complex when you get down to something like a display refrigerator, which basically by display, it means you can see the food in one way or another, right? So if it's open, clearly that means it's, like this, the bottom display case there. Closed would mean there's a glass door on it, essentially. Could be service or self-service, right? Which way is the opening facing? Is it facing the worker? Is it like a deli case? Is it facing externally to the customer? And then I'll get into type 1 and type 2, but you can have any kind of mix and match of these things. You could have an open self-service type 1, closed self-service type 2, and so on. So the testing doesn't necessarily change a ton with some of those differences, but it does definitely change as you go across these categories. So this has, I think, pretty profound effects when it comes to plan review, right? When you're required by code to make sure you have adequate refrigeration storage, and you're doing your refrigeration calculations to make sure that there's adequate for the amount of meals or whichever process you're using to do your calculations. There's some things that I think really need to be examined here when you're looking at refrigeration. Because if you're like me, I know a lot of time when I was in the field, you would see numerous places that just didn't have enough, right? So all of their refrigerators, everything they had was just chock full, especially on delivery days or shortly thereafter. It was crammed all together. And in worst case scenario, it was even sitting out because they didn't have room to put it in a refrigerator. So I think we really need to be mindful when we're doing plan review of erring on the side of caution and making sure these facilities have adequate refrigeration because of these potential problems, which I kind of have listed here. I don't think it's new to any of you folks, but poor airflow can certainly give temperature issues. I mean, these refrigeration units are designed to be stocked a certain way. So if you're blocking the airflow through there, you're certainly going to have issues with temps. Cooling issues, if you're trying to cool them inside of some of these, are a problem. I mentioned, even worst case, even stocking stuff outside or outside of the refrigerator because you don't have room for it. So going then down to this bottom piece here of items to consider. Not all of these refrigerators count towards storage capacity. That's why I kind of underline in bold and italicized storage here, right? This is what we're talking about. So prep cooler units, buffet units, blast chillers, any of these things should not be a part of your refrigerated storage calculations. And that's just not my opinion. It's something that I, pulled from, the CFP and FDA guidance on plan review. So none of those things should be counted. Now, to bullet point or kind of item number 2 there, when we talk about the beverage only units, like the bottom right-hand picture here, my personal opinion is I wouldn't include those as part of the refrigerated storage either, because usually when they're going to be used, what they're designed to be used for is just beverages. Beverages don't have to be under refrigerated storage. So I kind of just look at that as an added bonus thing, and you can put your pops in there and whatever to keep them cold, but it's really not for your potentially hazardous food or TCS food storage. So I would not include those as part of those calculations either. And I think oftentimes people do, and then when they come up with their calculations and they propose stuff, they end up short and facilities end up with a difficult time trying to keep all their food cool. So this is a really busy table, but this is the meat and potatoes, I think, what a lot of people always want to see. I often kind of comment that I could probably just put this table up and then walk away and people would be content with it. So this kind of gives you an idea of how we are testing all of these units, right? So for your reach-in storage units, and there's freezer and refrigerator there, but we'll just focus on the refrigerators. So we test those. It's a 4-hour test, and it's a no-load test. So it's just an air test with thermocouples put in there. And we test at an ambient temperature of 100 degrees. That is supposed to kind of simulate back of the house conditions, right? Where it's a little bit warmer or a lot bit warmer. And these things have to maintain 40 degrees or below over this 4-hour test. Freezers, same thing, but they are at 0. Now, that's pretty straightforward one. When we go to the third one down, the display refrigerator, and then if you go down, I really need to probably reorder this chart here. If you go down a couple more to the buffet / preparation tables, right? These are your flip top prep tables. Those are both tested at 86 degrees. And the reason this is because you will see these different types of units, sometimes in the back of the house, sometimes in the front of the house. And so it was kind of a comfortable medium to figure out what would that look like, or what might that temperature be? Because obviously out in the front of the house where you have buffet units or whatever, your ambient temperature generally is going to be much more controlled. So, you know, this 75-degree temperature or something probably makes sense. So I think they kind of split this difference and came up with the 86. The other thing to kind of take away from this, though, and to think about is with these flip top prep units, then we are testing these at 86 degrees. Okay. So if they are being placed, again, as part of the plan review, right? When you're looking at where these things are being done, if they're being placed right across from the char broiler and all this other kind of stuff in this narrow kind of galley kitchen area, and it's really, really warm blowing off of there, you might be asking this unit to hold the temperature that it can't possibly hold. And it wasn't certified to hold. The way these units generally are designed to be used is you have your top filled, you have your bottom filled with pre-filled inserts. And then as the top is done, you take the bottom out, you reload the top, and then you go from there. What they're not designed for is having the 85 trays of eggs under there and the waffle batter and the guys back and forth between underneath there in the grill and making omelets and pancakes all morning. He's open and shutting that thing every 10 seconds, right? That's not how those prep units were designed. And they're just not going to hold up. And I'm sure most of you have seen this in action, right? So there should be conscious effort to put these in a position where they are not going to be that negatively impacted by that much heat. And the other thing would be, of course, making sure that there's adequate ventilation to try to keep those working conditions so your temperatures don't get that high. Now, continuing on a little bit on that buffet flip top prep unit one, right? Because these are the ones that we always have, trouble with historically. Inspectors, they're the bane of our existence, probably as far as temperature violations go. They are tested with this. It's not an air test. This is the meat there. It says a methocellulose. So it's kind of gelatinous blobby material, a food simulant that they made based off of doing a lot of testing with a lot of different foods to find out which ones maybe artificially stayed too cold too long, which ones warmed up too fast, and kind of created a general bell curve of what is the most representative type of food, and that's where this kind of recipe for this kind of food simulant came from. So these are put into stainless steel inserts. It is an open top test. And I got a slide later on that kind of shows a little bit more detail, but it's a 4-hour test. And they have to hold below 41 degrees. And at the same time, the bottom area, this kind of the storage area underneath, I hesitate to call it storage after what I just said, but that has to maintain between 33 and 41. So that can't freeze. So that can't be cranked down so much that you're getting freezing temperatures in the bottom. That's a criteria for those. I'll just go down real quick to the rapid pull down. One, the blast chillers at the bottom. So those are tested at 100-degree ambient temperature, kind of back of the house type thing. The material we use is a sawdust mixture with some water, glycol. And the reason they use the sawdust is, and the sawdust is heated up to like 140 degrees, and then it starts the cooling process. And the reason they use the sawdust is this kind of came out of a little bit with when they were doing the prep units, the flip top prep units, kind of the work on those and trying to find out what the right food simulant would be. These sawdust mixtures were found to be too much of an insulator, so basically they maintained their temperature, whether it was hot or cold, better than most standard foods would. So if it's hot, it tends to stay hotter longer, right? It retains that heat. And then if it's cold, it tends not to warm up faster than other foods. So in doing that, they said, all right, well, this may be a good actual product to use for our blast chillers for the cooling process. Because if these can cool down this sawdust mixture that's hot from 135 to 40 in 4 hours, and it's not a 2-stage cooling here, it's 130 to 40, 4 hours period. then if it can do that, then it can pretty much do any sort of food, provided, of course, it's, portioned out correctly and not a 10-inch, big chunk of meat or a, 5-gallon pot of beans or something that's all put in there at one time, that type of stuff. So that's what those criteria are. The one I would just briefly touch on, the type 1 and type 2, because this does have impact on plan review as well. What we're looking at there, these are generally kind of your open front display case, like you might see in a grocery store, convenience store, that type of thing. And because this test actually goes back a little bit further than with the NSF standards with the ASHRAE stuff, the testing is done actually a little differently. So it's done on a 24-hour test. And there are little test packages that are put into these units, and I've got a slide demonstrating where those are as well. And they run for 24 hours, and they have to maintain an average of 41 or below and a max of 43. And I know probably some of you are saying, well, it shouldn't go over 41, but there is some allowances in there for when it goes, these things will go into a defrost cycle. And I'll show you kind of why as you look at where the packages are placed. But you can imagine if it's certainly going to hold 41 as an average over this entire time frame, any little bit it ticks up above 41 is going to be a brief amount of time. Now, if you are like me, when I first saw these, as I came over here a few years ago, I said, okay, a type 1 is tested at 75 and a type 2 is tested at 80. Why are we doing that? That seems really stupid. I couldn't figure out what the 5 degrees, like, why are we wasting our time with this? Well, originally, the display refrigerators were tested at 75 degrees because that simulated the ambient temperature, maybe in a grocery store, that type of thing, right? So that's where, that you're typically going to see these type of things put in. However, as time went on, we got feedback from regulators that some of these, especially maybe a little bit of the smaller, shorter ones, were going into convenience stores and some of these type places, corner stores, whatever, and those were routinely warmer than 75 degrees. And so there were concerns that these units were, not able to keep up. And so what happened then is there was a proposal to just let's start testing them at an 80 degree, a much more stringent, challenging test, especially when you have these open-faced units. Just going up 5 degrees can have quite a bit of impact on that food. Well, you had a lot of the manufacturers that were already certifying at 75 that only sell to grocery stores that said, no, our units are only going into these 75 degree things. We don't need to test at 80. We might not be able to make 80. We want to stay right where we're at. So national consensus standards, right? The 3-legged stool, everybody's involved. So what ultimately happened was we have 2 different components here. We have a type 1 or a type 2 tested at different temperatures. What I would say for you is if you are doing plan review and you have these type of display cooler that might go in, it may be worthwhile to be considering what type of ambient temperature, what type of facility is this going in? Where is this unit going to be? And whether or not you should be looking to, require or encourage them to be looking at type 2 type displays versus a type 1 if it needs to be something that is tested a little more robustly, let's say. So the no load air test, this is kind of the storage test I was talking about. Imagine your single door stainless steel storage unit or storage refrigerator, equally spaced top to bottom and left to right, and they have to maintain 41 degrees or below or 40 degrees or below over the 4 hours, right? Pretty straightforward concept there, I think, for everybody. So here's what the type 1 and type 2 things look like that I was talking about. So you can see how these are tested, and probably more appropriately, if you look at the one on the right, the side view, you begin to see as you look at the test packages that would be kind of on the front end, the service end, right? We stick them way out there, right at the very front edge. I don't know the one on the bottom. I don't know if it's just floating in space or what it is, but these ones at the leading edge, you can imagine when we go back to this idea of the 43 degrees, right? So if this thing kicks off for a defrost cycle for a short time, and now you have 75 or 80 degree heat bearing down on those ones that are right at the front edge, chances are they're going to start to creep up a little bit. But it shouldn't be too long before the thing kicks back on, gets it cooled back down again, and so on. And that's why the average over the long term still has to maintain 41 or below. So I mentioned the slide about the flip top prep units. This kind of gives you an idea of what we're looking at here. So they're 4-inch pans filled 3.5 inches deep, right? So a 1/2 inch from the top. So not like your facilities do where they stack tomatoes 18 feet high out of the top of these units and expect them to hold temp and so on, right? It's filled to a 1/2 inch below. And you can see where the thermocouples are placed there, 1 inch below the surface, 1/8 inch from the sidewall, 1/2 inch or 1/2 inch from the sidewall, 1/8 inch from the bottom. And then they're equally spaced then throughout, the entire width of the unit. As I mentioned, stainless steel, and these are uncovered, right? So the top is up, lids are off, and they have to maintain temp over a 4-hour time span. The idea here being the wisdom, the thought process, I think, behind the joint committee that writes these is within a 4-hour time, a couple things are going to happen. Either one, that food that's in there can be pulled, and there would be a replacement one coming from the bottom to refill, or you'll have the top pulled. Will eventually lids will go on, tops will go down, and it should recover even more if it's starting to drift out of temperature a little bit, something like that. But it does make a big difference in terms of how these things are used and where they're placed in terms of what the expectations can be placed on them, and something to be mindful of. Okay, so now going through all of these things, which I just covered, everything from the performance testing and the temperatures, right? The type 1s, the type 2s, flip tops, all of these, front of the house, back of the house, as well as the hygienic design pieces, right? The radius, the fasteners, the safe materials, non-toxic materials, all that. Hopefully now this should give you a good idea of what these labeled limitations are that go inside of these units. Or if you look into our listings and you see something that's listed as a type 1 unit, you should maybe begin to understand what that means, or if there's any of these other criteria that's put on there. So just kind of looking at these and walking through these, right? So in the upper left here, equipment intended for use in rooms having an ambient temperature of 86 degrees or less. That's pretty clearly telling you, these are one of these display units, flip top prep units, those type of things, right? It's just spelling out for you, this is the expectation of where this was tested and what can be done. If you look at the two under that, ambient temperature of 80, ambient temperature 75, these are the labels that are going to be in those type 1 and type 2 units for exactly what I was talking about. When you see these numbers in here, it's basically telling you this is what we tested it at, and this is where we confirmed that it meets the requirements of the standard. If you're operating above that, all bets are off on whether or not you're going to be effective in maintaining temp. Going to the upper right, I think we've all seen this on these beverage units. Equipment is intended for storage of non-potentially hazardous, might even say non-TCS now probably, bottled or canned products only. It doesn't stop people from wanting to, cool a giant pot roast inside of these things and store it with all sorts of other potentially hazardous foods, but they are not designed for that. They have not been tested to that. And if you really break down what this is trying to convey, so there's two things. One, it talks about the storage of non-potentially hazardous foods, right? So what that clue is, what that's telling you is we have not temperature tested this thing at all. For all we know, this is just a little cabinet that blows a little bit of cool air through there, but we don't know whether it holds any temp or not. We have not tested it. And then further, when it goes on to say bottled and canned products only, so basically packaged products only, what that's also telling you is something within the materials and or the hygienic design does not meet the food zone requirements, the exposed food requirements, right? The food safety requirements. So it could be they've got fasteners in there. Could be they have their radiuses aren't compliant. Could be they have non-toxic materials, whatever it is. And it could be just they never tested it because they don't want to. They just want to say, we just want a little cabinet with a little cool air and we're going to put this label in and we're going to move on. But so just, I guess my whole point is to understand where this is coming from or what this is telling you, and keep that in mind when people are proposing it to use it for other things. And then the bottom one, I think is an interesting one to touch on. And you don't see these very often, but the label is required out there for certain pieces. The equipment is intended for the storage and display of packaged products only. So you'll notice in there, there's not a number. And so it was tested to the standard performance testing, which is typically probably going to be a storage or display. So it could be 86, could be 100. But the thing is here, it doesn't delineate and doesn't say you can't store potentially hazardous food in there, right? It doesn't say for only non-potentially hazardous food, whatever. So we have temp tested this thing, and it does hold according to the standard. Usually in this case, it's probably going to be 100 degrees is what we tested this at, because I guess that's the standard, setting for these storage units, right? So we don't necessarily put that 100 degrees on there. But the other thing, so we would say potentially hazardous is fine here, but it says display and package for the display of packaged products only. So no exposed foods. So what does that mean? Going back to what we talked about before, if you can't have exposed foods, if you can't have the food contact, food zone requirements met, you got to go with packaged products, which means then with this unit, again, safe materials have not been validated, there's radius issues, or there's fastener issues, or it doesn't necessarily mean there's issues. It means they either there were issues or they weren't inspected, they weren't verified, right? So hopefully that kind of gives you an idea of where these are coming from, what these labels mean, and the potential impacts they may have in your facilities. And something to be mindful of. Again, I keep going back to when you're doing these plan reviews, because it's a heck of a lot harder if you've already approved these beverage units that aren't allowed to really store any potentially hazardous food, weren't tested for that, but you already recorded that as part of their refrigerated storage. They've already got it in there. They're already wanting to put all their hot dogs and everything else in there. It's kind of hard to go backwards from that point. So I think it's really important to be mindful of these things on the front end when doing plan reviews. So some summary takeaway points here. And I think I've kind of hopefully maybe oversaturated you folks with these, but the requirements for design, materials, and performance vary upon the proposed use, right? So if it's a blast chiller, if it's a flip top, if it's a storage, all of these the design material performance can change. Certainly the performance and the design of materials is really going to be about whether or not you can have exposed food, whether or not it's non-toxic, whether or not the radius and those type of things are in place, or if it's required to have packaged food. And those boxes can give you a clue, right? If it's being used for its intended use. These have, going back down to the third point here, right? These have an impact on plan review. I think I've tried to make that case pretty clear as I could, that I think it's very important to be mindful when you're doing these calculations to avoid and head off problems after construction has begun or the facility has been opened, or pre-opening inspection, whatever it is, that you get on the front end of these things and at least be mindful of what's being proposed and how they're going to be using it. Last two bullets here. The standards and the certified products are valuable tools, and we encourage you to use them. My personal opinion, and yes, I know I work for NSF now, but as a former inspector and somebody that had to do plan reviews and do a lot of these things, and speaking with states and people in my state, we did not have any requirements for certification. And I think things were a lot more difficult. You had a lot more looking at pieces and going, well, maybe I shouldn't approve this. I don't really know. You ask, your buddy's opinion, and they give one a little different than you, and you don't know what to do with it. The certification takes all of that out. And I can tell you from the places that I've talked to that use certification or require certified equipment in their facilities, are much happier as far as their plan review go, because they just have to check, make sure that it's a legit certification, and they're moving on. And they know that they're safeguarded from having something go in that may be not easily cleanable, that doesn't meet the standards, that may have an impact potentially on public health or a foodborne outbreak. And then the last thing, going back to the standards process in general, we have a long partnership with environmental health, with health departments. It's where our founding was. We have the shared mission. We always encourage you to be involved in helping develop the standards, bring your expertise, bring your knowledge. It's always tremendously valuable to everything we're trying to accomplish. And with that, I think that's it. And I think I did pretty good on time here, so I can open it up for some questions if that's good, Rachel, or whoever emceeing.
Yep, that would be great. Do we have any questions for Derek? Feel free to enter them in the chat or unmute yourself. Okay, it looks like we have one question in the chat, Derek. Do you know if there are equivalent standards for overseas equipment?
I don't. It's a very interesting question, right? Because so there's a couple things. One, if you see, first of all, if you see the CE mark, I generally tell folks that largely what that is a self-certification. It doesn't mean the European standards and the way they do things aren't robust or aren't protective, but it is largely a self-certification that goes on there. Now, as far as the standards go, this is why when I put up that slide about the FDA food code language, right? And I was the one that worked through the Conference for Food Protection to get that change, because before it would just say to sanitation. It didn't specify what standards. Well, if the whole idea is to have a standard that ensures compliance with the FDA food code, the only ones that are going to do that are the American National Standards, are basically the NSF standards, right? Because those have regulators like you guys, they have FDA, they have all of these folks at the table making sure that those standards are in compliance with our food code. We have no idea if the Australian standards, meet the FDA food code, or, we also aren't there at the table to update them and see what's, going on. So that's the difficulty. A lot of these ones around the world may be robust. Heck, they may be better than our food code and our standards, but we don't have any kind of control or oversight or input into them like we do the American National Standards. And that's why the focus largely is, and the code requirements largely are on the American National Standards, the NSF ANSI standard.
Thank you. It looks like we're getting some more questions. The next one is, what do you think about ETL certification standards?
That's a loaded question. How do I answer that? So under the code, or generally, for requirements, the regulators are somewhat bound to take anything that's certified by an ANSI accredited certifier, and Intertek ETL, they are accredited to certify. I will reserve comment. I guess what I will say is, I know that how we operate our labs and our standards and the integrity we do with work. I'm not saying ETL doesn't. I'm just going to say I don't know anything about their operations. And so we leave that kind of determination up to individual specifiers, whether it's certain restaurant chains or other people. They're allowed to say, we only want NSF or something like that. But as far as generally for regulators, for you folks, it's generally, any of these accredited certifiers oftentimes have to be accepted. Unless, of course, you find something. I guess this is another point I want to impart. Like, occasionally you're going to find something that has a certification mark. And if you think it's, not up to the standards, or you have real concerns about it, you certainly can still not approve it. That's always within the health department's purview. And we always want that feedback from our end. That's partly what my job is to hear these complaints and have people contact me and say, hey, Derek, what's going on with this piece? Should this be certified? Is this fraud? Is this whatever? And try to work through a lot of that. So I guess, that's kind of ultimately where I'll leave it. I can't say too much specifically about ETL and their certifications. I just don't know their processes to speak on them, nor would I as a competitor.
Thank you, Derek. Our next question, are there any HD that don't allow establishments to hold non-packaged items in a Coca-Cola cooler?
That I don't know. I mean, I could tell you across the country, certainly there are. I don't know if that's meant more for me or just kind of a round robin for the folks there in Illinois to say, is anybody else allowing this or not? I can tell you, interestingly, in my days at the health department, our directive from the state was that we were to be very careful with enforcing something like that. Other states have no problem, or other jurisdictions have no problem saying this label limitation says do not put potentially hazardous food in here. You're not allowed to do it. You're not using the equipment as it was designed. And so it definitely happens across the country. I can tell you that.
Next question, are the NSF standards available online?
No, because standards development actually takes a fair amount of money. And we really, this small amount that we actually, and so yeah, that's why it's a not-for-profit. We have to feed other money into it to keep the standards process going. But they do make a little bit of money off sale of standards to industry folks and stuff like that. That's why we don't make them, at least for now, publicly available to them, and for that reason. But you can reach out to me, or if you go onto our website, there's our regulatory page, and there's a way you can submit something in there asking for the standards, or again, you can get my contact information from here and just let me know what standards you want and whatever, and I can email you PDFs of all of them, no problem. They're free for regulators. We want them in your hands.
Looks like last question. How come NSF tests prep top units with stainless steel containers if they all sell with plastic containers?
Well, that's an interesting question. So we don't, if a unit is specifically sold with, I'm trying to get this right as I talk to our food equipment folks, kind of specially provided plastic inserts, then we will test with those. Most of them are not. Most of them will sell them, and they'll have the unit, and then they'll also sell inserts. They'll sell plastic ones, they'll sell stainless steel. And so I don't know how often they come with them or not, but that's generally how that works. So if it is something that is specifically supplied with it, that's what we use. But if it's kind of a generic, just open rail thing with inserts, then we go with the stainless steel. That's as far as I understand it. Again, this is probably kind of maybe a little of the nuance of the joint committee work that I'm not super engaged on, but I think that's probably the case. That's the way I understand it. And as we all know, right? I mean, stainless steel is the way to go in those. They're already taxed because of, again, I talked about the temperatures they're tested under, people overfilling them, using the bottom, keeping the top up. If you're using plastic, yeah, you're in major trouble. Generally speaking, probably.
Okay, I think that concludes all of our questions. Thank you very much, Derek. That was a great presentation.
Perfect. Thanks a lot. Appreciate it. If anybody's got any other questions, I don't know if you got my email off of that last slide, but I know Rachel now has it. Other people have it. So feel free to reach out to me anytime if there's anything I can do. It's why I'm here. I'm here for you folks. So whatever we can do to help, let us know. Thank you.
All right, our next speaker is Justin Dwyer with the Peoria City County Health Department, and he'll be presenting on the Home to Market Act and farmers markets. And I will now turn it over to Justin.
Thank you very much. Go ahead and get my screen going here. Can everyone see that? Is everyone able to see my screen?
Yep, it's visible.
Perfect. Thank you. All right. So today we're going to talk about the new Home to Market Act, which went into effect on January 1st of this year. And then also the proposed farmers market bill, SB 3838, which is currently in the Illinois State House under review there. Okay, so we'll go ahead and start out with the Home to Market Act. This is the newest cottage food law, essentially. So the foundations of the Home to Market Act, it's under the Food Handler Regulation Enforcement Act. And then it's essentially, it's covering the side of cottage food. So essentially what cottage food is, it allows for people to make products in their home, and unlicensed, like farm kitchen, in their home personal kitchen, and then they're able to sell direct to consumer. This bill was mainly spearheaded by the Illinois Stewardship Alliance, and the main changes for this one, or the overhauls, were addressing the registration, the expansion of sales avenues, additional food safety requirements, and then also labeling, changes to the labeling requirements. So in a little background, in August 2021, IDPH was meeting regularly with over 30 stakeholders, which included NIPIC, SIPC, IEHA, City of Chicago, Illinois Farm Bureau, Extension, et cetera. And basically, we're kind of running through the law and then creating guidance, which was required under the law itself. So breaking down and kind of getting into the law, understanding this law a little more, we'll start out with the definitions. So a lot of the definitions, some of the confusion you can find in there. So for example, cut leafy greens, the definition of cottage food operation, equilibrium, pH, and then defining like a farmer's market, what a leafy green is, local health departments, low acid canning, etc. So just a couple additional notes. This is the pH water activity table from the FDA model food code. So when you are thinking about, looking at pH and where things are falling, this is going to be one of those tables that you can use as reference. It is not in the Cottage Food Act itself, but I certainly do use it for reference. And then this is going to be for non-packaged products. And then this table is going to be for packaged products. So most of the pHs that we're referring to are going to be based on pH, or water activity is going to be based off of this table. So also additional definitions, microgreens, potentially hazardous food, and sprouting. For those of you that don't know the difference or don't remember the difference between microgreens and sprouts, microgreens are harvested just above the soil line. They also have more time of growth, whereas a sprout is going to have a much shorter time in growth, and it's still going to have the root, which is also one of the reasons why sprouts are not allowed, but microgreens are allowed. Okay, so going through the act itself, the first part we'll talk about the registration and operations. So a cottage food operator can make food, homemade food, essentially, foods and drinks, when certain situations are met. So the first thing they're going to do is they're going to register with the local health department or local unit of government, which they're preparing their product, not where they're going to sell it, but where they're going to prepare it. And then they need to make sure that they have a copy of the certificate of registration or some other form that a health department that's going to follow up with them can access. So the big one to think through, I would say, is the restrictions. And these are the very specific list of products that they are not allowed to do with the exemptions. So first one, they are not allowed to do any meat, poultry, fish, seafood, or shellfish. There's no exemptions to this. They are not allowed to do this product at all. The next one is going to be dairy, with the exception as in a ingredient in a non-potentially hazardous baked good or candy such as caramel, or as an ingredient in a baked good frosting such as buttercream. So they are allowed to have dairy if it's a part of any of these exemptions. The next one is going to be eggs. Eggs are not allowed except in a non-potentially hazardous food, including baked good or in dry noodles, buttercream frosting if the egg is not raw. And then pumpkin pie, sweet potato pies, cheesecake, custard pies, cream pies, pastries with potentially hazardous fillings or toppings are not allowed. Garlic and oil, or garlic or oil infused with garlic, except if the garlic oil is acidified. Low acid canned foods, sprouts, cut leafy greens, except for cut leafy greens that are dehydrated, acidified, or blanched and frozen, cut or fresh tomatoes or melon, dehydrated tomato or melon, frozen cut melon, wild harvest non-cultivated mushrooms, alcoholic beverages, and kombucha. These are the products that are not allowed under cottage food. So a couple of additional notes for health departments to think about. So TCS foods are allowed under cottage food. So what we need to make sure that we're doing is we are determining if a product is TCS, then it needs to be kept 41 or below. If the vendor is not wanting to do that, or the vendor is making a claim that is not a TCS food, then we can certainly suggest that the vendor has lab testing conducted on that product to prove it's not a TCS food. If they're able to prove it, then it's going to be fine. Otherwise, they need to maintain it at proper temperature. One item that keeps coming up to supplements not intended for food use or don't qualify to be food do not qualify under cottage food. I've had several people submit they're going to do hemp or CBD cookies, and I've gone back and said, this is not a cottage food product. This is not going to be a food product at this time. So I didn't allow them to register any of those products under cottage food. So the next part is canned tomatoes. In order to sell canned tomatoes, one of two things must happen. You either need to receive a proven recipe from USDA or state cooperative extension, or they need to submit the recipe at the cottage food operator's expense to a commercial lab for testing. The testing is annual testing. And this is the only way that they can sell any product that has tomatoes in it. And this is very specific to tomatoes themselves. So if they're wanting to do canned salsa or a marinara or something along those lines, it can't have any other restricted items in it, and they would have to follow one of these two ways to sell that product. If a vendor is going to ferment or acidify products, once again, they have two avenues to go down. They can submit a proven recipe through United States Department of Agriculture or state cooperative, or they can submit the written food safety plan for each category of product they're going to do. And then they will need to have lab testing for each type of product. So essentially, this seems a little confusing, but if they're going to be pickling vegetables, they only need to submit lab testing for one of those items. That's the same process across the board. Same with fermentation or hot sauce. If they're going to ferment and it's the same process for 6 different items, then they only need to submit one of those for lab testing. The lab testing is good for 3 years. So every 3 years they need to do that, and they need to continue to follow the food safety plan that they're going to submit to the local health department. So continuing on, fermented or acidified foods, they either need to be properly canned using a boiling water bath method in Mason style jar or a glass container with a tight fitting lid, or they need to be in a new properly sealed container and held at 41 degrees or below. Also, some additional regulations to the Cottage Food Act. If anyone's going to sell baked goods with cheese, local health departments can request laboratory testing. I can tell you when I've been reviewing different things, if it's a cheese I know to be potentially hazardous, I probably will request lab testing on that. If it's a hard cheese that we know is not a potentially hazardous, I may not request that. I may ask for a copy of the recipe and just kind of look to see how much product is being used, and just kind of make an assessment from there. The next thing is if a cottage food operator is not utilizing a municipal water supply, so a public water supply, if they are on a well, then the local health department can ask for testing of coliform or E. coli on an annual basis. So if they are on a well, please do ask that question. I think it's on the application, and then definitely ask for lab testing. Even if they're not using that product in the product itself, or they're not using that water in the product itself, they're still going to be potentially washing their hands, doing dishes, etc. So we want to make sure that that water supply is safe. And then last one for this slide, cottage food operators need to be a certified food protection manager. So they do need to have that ANSI certificate that we do require across the state. So we'll get into labeling. Labeling is a little complex as well. So what needs to be on this label is the name of the cottage food operator, so their business name, and then the unit of local government in which the product is operating in. So for example, if they were here in Peoria County, the name of their operation is going to be on that label, and then they're also going to have Peoria County on that label as well. Every county is issuing or should be issuing some type of a registration number, and then that will need to be on the label as well. And then the common or usual name of the food, all the ingredients, along with color, artificial flavors, preservatives listed, descending order. And then the big one, and this is verbatim, so this exact phrase needs to be on the product. It says, this product was produced in a home kitchen, not inspected by a health department, that may also process common food allergens. If you have safety concerns, contact your local health department. That last sentence was just added for this act. It was a little different prior to. And then also the date the product was processed, and then any allergen labeling required. So if there's any allergens in the product, we want to make sure that we have those listed. They are able to use the phrases Illinois grown, Illinois sourced, or Illinois farm product if they do meet the requirements of that section. And then if any case a product can't be properly packaged, or it's difficult to package, they can have it, the products in a non-prepackaged state and package at an event with the approval of the health department where they're selling that product. So I'll give the example for that. If it's a out-of-town vendor or cottage food establishment, they're registered in a different county. If they want to do something like that in my county, in Peoria County, they will have to reach out and gain permission from us to not prepackage their product. I think when we were going through negotiations, a few examples where people had different baked goods, they could have different labels they could put on the outside of packaging, but not having the individual package, and more of like I guess a bakery style is the concept behind that. And then also the warning statement needs to be physically displayed. Kind of like, well, it says notice shall be placard, so it needs to be displayed. If they're selling online, it needs to be at the point of sale interface. And if they're selling at a market or another location, I always tell them to put it at the point of sale as well. So some additional notes. The labels no longer require an address. The main reason for that is many cottage food vendors had safety concerns about putting their home personal address on the labeling. So during negotiations, the agreement was with the registration number and the county name. The health departments could still do proper traceback of any products. And then also one other note, if a cottage food vendor is going to do juicing, they still must be in compliance with 21 CFR 101.17G, which is all the federal requirements for juicing. So they will need to have, if they're not pasteurizing the product, they will need to have the unpasteurized warning statement. And if they are going to pasteurize, they will have to follow all of those requirements under this section and meet all of those requirements. I do believe we are currently working on the guidance, which should hopefully be released in the next, hopefully few weeks. And this will be noted in that guidance as well. And then the sales locations, basically the avenue routes. So it is not limited to the following: farmers markets, fairs, festivals, public events, or online, pickup from a private home or farm, delivered directly to the consumer, or picked up through a third-party private sale with consent of the third-party property holder. This would be kind of like the farm baskets. The cottage food vendor would be able to put their product in those farm baskets and distribute it in that manner. If they are going to ship, shipping is limited within the state of Illinois. And then the product may not be potentially hazardous. It also must be sealed in a manner that's going to reveal tampering, like a sticker, a pop top, etc. Registration: the cottage food vendor must register in the county which they reside, their primary residence, and the local health department may not impose a fee in excess of $50 for that registration. As far as complaint investigations go, there are four main reasons why we would conduct a complaint investigation. The first one would be any imminent health hazard, misbranding, adulterated, or not in compliance. Those would be the reasons why we would go to someone's property to conduct an investigation in their kitchen, in their home. If we need to do that, we reserve the right to inspect the premises of the cottage food operation in question. Local health departments are able to set a reasonable fee for the inspection, and we do have the right to suspend the cottage food registration until all concerns have been addressed and corrected. And if we do have continuing concerns or continuing issues, the local health department has created a process, they are able to revoke that cottage food registration. If you receive a complaint from another jurisdiction, another county, then you would reach out to that jurisdiction, to that local health department, and notify them with the information. So for example, if I were to receive a complaint here in Peoria County and it was one of my neighboring counties, I would reach out to that county. I would notify them of that complaint, and they would go ahead and follow up with that vendor and conduct any inspections as needed. So under the act itself, there were some requirements for guidance documents. So there was a creation of a standard registration form, development of a home certification self-checklist, a written food safety plan, which is going to be used for fermented and acidified foods, the development of a standardized inspection form, and then also kind of a process behind that, and then general information providing to the cottage food vendor, cleaning products, sanitation, and just general guidance, which is currently being worked on right now. So a couple other spots on this, additional regulations in the Cottage Food Act. If it's a bake sale, it does not fall under cottage food. And then there are some comments on the home rules in here. So if you are home rule jurisdiction, make sure you're aware of those. And then I just wanted to show everyone, this is the certificate that Peoria County is currently using. So we have the name of the cottage food vendor. Our director will sign above the line. Right here, we have registration number, yearly registration, and then the certificate's valid. So basically when that certificate expires, we have the warning statement on here. And then we are also adding in the list of approved items. And then also the TCS foods. The main reason for that is we want to make it easier on the inspectors going out, knowing what actually needs to be held at proper temperature. So, and juices, cider, and then vegan sushi rolls. This is a fictitious certificate, by the way. No one is currently trying this, but I will say give it time. All right, and then we'll go ahead and get started. This is the proposed farmers market law or update.
Hey, Justin,
Yes.
I don't know if you wanted to. There are quite a few questions about the cottage food stuff in particular. Are you doing all questions at the end, or do you want to handle those first and then move on to farmers market?
Okay, so I guess I apologize. I should have prefaced this in the beginning. What my plan was is I'm going to go through the entire presentation. We'll start going through questions. IDPH is going to speak from 3 to 4. So if we do not get to all the questions, I'm going to come back at 4 o'clock after IDPH is finished, and we'll continue to answer those questions. So I figure there are quite a few, so I am trying to kind of get through this just to cover as many questions during my time period as possible. But thank you, Steph. Okay, so as I said, this is the proposed act. It has not been passed in Illinois yet. However, if it is, it will go into effect January 1st, 2023. Essentially, there were concerns with licensing and the costs associated with certain vendors selling at farmers markets. So a large stakeholder group went ahead and worked with the Farm Bureau and Stewardship Alliance, and we essentially negotiated this bill. So some of the definitions that were added in, and I'm not going through the entire bill, I'm just going through what was added to the current section now. That we defined farmer, licensed permitted facility, we defined main ingredient. And then essentially local health departments are charged with creating a farmer's market license. And that is going to be for any vendor, or I should say farmer, selling meat, poultry, dairy, or eggs, or a frozen product where the main ingredient is grown or raised on the farm. Those products must be prepackaged at a licensed or permitted facility. And then as far as dairy goes, raw milk is still not allowed. So this does not alter any obligations of the Grade A Pasteurized Milk or Milk Products Act. So a few of the items we can request. So basically they'll apply, we can get a list of the products they intend to sell. We can require that they have a thermometer for any refrigeration cold holding units, maintain equipment in good shape, prevent or holding product at proper temperature. Product must be at 41 or below, frozen product 32 or below. If they have any non-TCS foods that are meat, dairy, poultry products like jerkies, etc., we can require documentation to prove that it's a non-TCS product. Find out where they're making those products. If they are selling eggs, an Illinois egg license issued by Department of Ag. And then we can conduct at least one annual inspection. And then if need be, we can have the farmer go to an alternate location. So you could have them come to the health department to conduct an inspection at that location or another location, if that's what your health department chooses to do. As far as fees go, there are caps to the fees. Local health department may not charge more than $75 for anyone that's permitted selling eggs only, and may not charge more than $175 for a full farmers market permit, meat, poultry, dairy, eggs, frozen foods, etc. And then also one of the great things, I was really happy we got into this. These aren't permanently set. So if the law goes in effect in 2023, every 3 years, those caps will increase by 10%. So 20 years down the road, we're not still sitting on those same caps. And then just a few of the requirements. If you are creating a permit, local health departments need to have basically hold some form of a public meeting. This could be during a Board of Health meeting or any other meeting that you might have regularly. Get written information or send out a written notice, contact any vendors that it's going to be affected by, and get their input on the process itself, especially when it comes to setting fees or any time that those fees are going to be adjusted. The other thing, you can't change, or we're not allowed to adjust the fee more than once a year. And then once again, we basically just need to work with our partners to discuss the process and make sure that it's an open forum. And then statement about home rule. And then if there's any concerns about non-compliance, we are able to suspend, issue citation, fines, etc., depending on what your local jurisdiction has. And we're able to take care of, I guess, the problems that we may run into. Okay, so I managed to do that in like a half hour, which is great. I'm sure we have a lot of cottage food questions. If anybody wants to write down my information, if you have any questions past this date, please don't ever hesitate to reach out to me. I'm more than happy to help anyone that needs it understanding. I know cottage food is confusing, and I've been fairly involved with it for the past 6 or 7 years in Peoria County. But otherwise, I'm going to close my slide out so I can see the chats and everything. All right, I'm just trying to find, I guess, where the questions started.
Justin, I'm looking back to, this is Rachel. Okay, it looks like our first question was, at what point would you be determining if a fermented product requires refrigeration? Will this be required to be denoted on the label? For example, a vendor from another county is selling fermented products at my farmer's market. How do I know if they were initially told to keep them refrigerated?
So I actually really like that question. And I'm going to make notes too, so I can go back if there's any questions in this, we can try and add stuff to guidance. Well, what I would say is, if we're going to determine if a product is, we're going to look at the lab testing, and then we're going to, I guess, determine, well, locally, we're going to determine if that product is being held properly, given the water activity pH. What I would say is, as far as if it's required to be refrigerated 41 or below, I guess my answer to that would be, I mean, you could reach out to that health department if you question it. That was one of the reasons why on our certificate we added the TCS product. So even if they go to another health department, hopefully if the inspector is reviewing product, they will know exactly what we've considered a TCS product. Does that answer the question?
Yes, Mr. Dwyer, thank you.
Okay, our next question. Can cold brew coffee be made / sold under cottage food?
I would say yes. So when you're reviewing, and this is what I do every time I'm reviewing, if there's any questionable product, I always go back to the restricted products, and I would look to see if there's anything that's going to be considered restricted. Now, I can tell you, I would require the cold brew coffee to be kept, or I would consider it a TCS food. But there would be nothing under the act that would stop you from doing cold brew.
Next question, does Peoria County charge for cottage food registration? And if so, how much?
Yes, Peoria County does charge. We are currently at the cap of $50. The main reason, we go through each and every application continuously. We issue the certificates, and then when we are out in the field, we do stop by and check those stands. So we are currently at the maximum cap.
Next question, how are microgreens allowed?
Microgreens. So microgreens are allowed because they're technically considered an agricultural product. So there can, well, let me step back on that one for a second. Sprouts are the main concern because they're under the soil. Microgreens themselves are cut above the soil. They will be allowed because once they're cut or field harvested, they're an ag product. So therefore, all they needed to be do is washed, and then they're a ready-to-eat product. This, what I would say, is no different than any heavy lettuce or anything else that would be allowed under the act. And I know I've had discussions with IDPH on this a couple times, and that was kind of the interpretation that I got back on it.
Hey, what standards could we use to inspect the premises of someone's home?
So there is a form to conduct an inspection. The main reasons you're going to conduct an inspection, let me pull that slide back up. So if there's a foodborne illness complaint or consumer complaint, so we would have a concern of an imminent health hazard. If we have any concerns about misbranding adulterated product, or if they're not in compliance, then we'd have the right to conduct an inspection. We do have that form that was released along with a guidance document on conducting an inspection. And that's the form that was developed and we would use.
How can we conduct inspection on private homes if used for food preparation under cottage law? I think that was.
So if you read the application that they actually sign, does provide us permission to conduct an inspection under the basis of a complaint or illness. So the act itself allows us to go. We are not able to conduct, for example, like a preliminary or a final inspection or anything that we would normally do for a licensed establishment. However, we are able to respond to complaint-based concerns. And the main reason for that, I will say, is I've worked with Stewardship Alliance quite a bit over the past few years, and concerns or of products themselves, they definitely want us responding, and they want to avoid outbreaks and things of that nature.
Next one, how and why are spring rolls and sushi rolls with cooked veggies allowed if they are considered TCS products?
Yeah, so there is nothing in the law that says you can't sell TCS products. I know when the Cottage Food Act first came out, it basically, a couple versions, it was, here's a list of the products that you're allowed to do. And then it flipped to, here's the list of the products you're not allowed to do. So a vendor is allowed to sell a TCS product. It needs to be maintained at 41 degrees or below. properly. But there is nothing in the act that says you can't sell a TCS product except for certain situations where they're referring to, like pumpkin pie and other things like that. So as always, go back to that restriction list and read through that restriction list when you're comparing those products.
Thank you. Our next question, if a cottage food certificate of registration was suspended or revoked, how would another jurisdiction or health department know that?
That's actually, that's a really good question. I think that's something we need to look at internally. If there's a way to notify, because in theory, yes, they could make copies of their certificate and then still go to other jurisdictions. So I guess that's something we really need to look at. Thank you. I do appreciate that. That's a good comment. Good question.
Next question, for the canned tomatoes, do they also need a pH test each batch or just annually? Also, in regards to labeling, we're having some labels end up being quite large. Do all ingredients need to be broken down on the label? For example, butter, sweet cream, salt, chocolate chips, etc.
So as far as canning goes, it would be the wording. We were actually discussing this the other day in our cottage food group. The wording's a little odd in section B of 1.6. I think the interpretation we're currently looking at is if you're using the same varietal tomato, then you would just need to have that testing done. But if you're changing it, then the testing would need to be redone if you're changing your varietal. We do need to get some more clarification, and I do expect that to be covered under the guidance that we should see in the next few weeks. I hope that answers it on the for the canned tomatoes. As far as labeling goes, I think that's still another discussion we're having. Continuous breakdown. Is butter just butter, or is butter sweet cream and salt, chocolate chips, etc.? And I think that's a question that we need to work with our I guess food group, cottage food group, to determine. I don't think we ever settled on anything. I know Corinne's on the line. Do you remember settling on anything, Corinne?
I do not. However, I think we were leaning towards including all of the sub ingredients as well.
So for now, I would just recommend sub ingredients unless you heard or hear otherwise. I do know that makes those labels quite large.
Our next question, are fresh herbs like basil allowed as ingredients, or are they considered cut leafy greens?
Fresh herbs would not be classified as cut leafy greens.
Next question, are dietary supplements permitted as an additive, i.e. vitamin C, vitamin E, other non-FDA regulated supplements intended for consumption?
Corinne, do you want to take that one? I know you were doing research on that.
Yeah, so the research that I was doing was more about if they could produce something that they called a dietary supplement. And it really comes down to the intended use. So that determines whether a product is a conventional food or a dietary supplement or a drug. So I think one of the big food products that came up was tinctures. And somebody was like, I use this tincture to make frosting with, to flavor frosting, right? And so I think that the intended use is a food for flavoring. Whereas then she later on said, well, sometimes it can be used if you put 3 drops under your tongue for some other use. And so if the intended use is more of a drug or more of a a supplement, then that is not allowed to be produced under cottage food. So you really have to do, ask what that intended use is, and they can't lie to you. So, I mean, they can lie to you, obviously, but if their advertising also sort of leans towards an intended use that is not a food product, that is one way that can be proven that it is not food and cannot be produced under cottage food. I haven't done a lot of research on using dietary supplements as a food additive. Again, I would say it really comes down to the intended use and if those additives are approved for food use. Obviously, there's some things that are not approved for food use or that are still going through the FDA to be approved for food use. So those things would not be allowed to be used under cottage food. And they cannot make health claims. So if they're adding the vitamins to their food for a specific reason, they cannot make a health claim on their packaging saying like, take this because it has a lot of these vitamins and it'll cure your flu or anything like that. So there are federal labeling laws that still need to be maintained, and it does get very dicey when we're dealing with dietary supplements and drugs.
Thank you, Corinne.
Next question. Alcoholic beverages are not allowed, but what about alcohol used in a baked good?
Yes, that is allowed, and the guidance should have some additional information. I do know there's a code section in Illinois. I think you can't have, or it must contain less than 5% by volume of alcohol. So that will be in the guidance. But the Cottage Food Act is very specific to no alcohol, no alcoholic beverages. It says nothing about using alcohol in baked goods or other products.
Next question. Can a farmer cook meat on a grill at a farmer's market and offer it for sampling under the IDPH sampling certificate?
Actually, yes. So I had a farmer doing that a couple of years ago. He had sausages made from pork that he was producing, and he had, I guess it was kind of like a little electric flat top, and he would cook it, cut it up. He just followed the requirements of that sampling certificate. So absolutely, yes, they can.
If a vendor is juicing and they will keep the juice refrigerated at all times, do they need a product assessment? They will put keep refrigerated on the label.
I'd highly recommend it. I'd have to really go through the CFR to see if that is required. I can tell you, unless they prove otherwise, we're going to require the labeling, both the cottage food warning statement and the juicing statement. But I don't think there's anything that we could force them to leave keep refrigerated or force them to put keep refrigerated on the label.
And we have had a couple comments, not a question, that it's said that listing sub ingredients would be important for identifying allergens, like i.e. if chocolate chips contain soy. So they would need to include soy in the allergen statement. So we've had a couple comments like that come through.
And thank you for that feedback. Those are the kind of things that, we're always asking about, we always want. So thank you for those feedbacks.
Next question. Can the cottage food producers make cream cheese frosting, not just buttercream frosting?
So this has actually been I'll say a hot topic amongst our group. So if we go to the restricted section, it says dairy except as an ingredient in a non-potentially hazardous baked good or candy, such as caramel, or as an ingredient in a baked good frosting, such as buttercream. I think the interpretation that we're starting to lean towards is that, yes, that would be allowed. However, without proof of it being a non-TCS food, it would be a TCS food. And therefore, we would require it to be maintained at 41 degrees or less. I think that's kind of where we're falling right now in that work group.
And it looks like this is our last question in the chat. Can a cottage food vendor provide samples?
Yes, a cottage food vendor can provide samples in, I would say, two different ways. If they are at a farmer's market, they could do that sampling certificate, or they could pre-package their samples because they are required to pre-package items, well, unless they have other approval from the health department. But I would say those would be the two main ways that they can sample.
Thank you. Do we have any additional questions? Looks like I think we've answered all the ones that came through in the chat.
All right. Well, thank you, everyone. I know cottage food is, it's not everyone's favorite thing in the world. I know it is somewhat complex and confusing at times. It looks like we got one more question coming in, but I'll finish up my comments. So what I will say, though, if you do have questions, concerns, anything like that, please don't hesitate to reach out to myself or anyone else involved in the cottage food work group. I mean, that's how we better it. We know at some point the Cottage Food Act will get reopened and things will change. And we need to know where the issues actually are so that when that act does change, we can address those items.
It looks like we had another question come through. If a cottage food vendor uses eggs in a buttercream frosting, do the eggs have to be pasteurized?
So the restrictions itself say if the eggs are not raw. I don't think we've completely figured that one out. But I would say my personal interpretation is the eggs would need to be cooked if they're in a buttercream frosting. An unpasteurized egg would be, in my opinion, raw. But the guidance says the eggs are not raw, is how they're allowed. I know that probably is kind of confusing. Are the slides going to be available for download? I'll send this presentation to Paul, our office manager, and ask that he puts it up on the IEHA website under the conference, and you guys are more than welcome to access it, review it, etc. Looks like we have a couple more questions coming in.
Next question, are there any issues with using farm fresh eggs in cottage food products if the farm fresh eggs are not from your own farm?
No, there is not. As long as it's I would call it an approved source. So as long as they're following Department of Ag rules and requirements by selling those eggs, which would be on the person selling the eggs, you can use farm fresh eggs in your cottage food product.
Next kind of question, reading through the act, TCS foods are prohibited except those few items that are allowed as ingredients. It implies the intent is not to have TCS foods.
I know we've gone back and forth on this. The main list, or at least when this was negotiated out, I would say the main list was essentially the most concerning products. But that being said, there are some exceptions to that. But that being said, there unfortunately is nothing in the law that stops. So if somebody wanted to make, for example, vegan soup, or they were going to do a soup with rice in it or something along those lines, those would be TCS foods, and we would require them to make those or to keep that 41 degrees or below. However, none of that would be in, or as long as there's no restricted items, they would be allowed to do so.
Okay, I don't see any more questions in the chat.
All right, well, we can take a few minutes before, take a little few minute break before IDPH. I'll send the slideshow to Paul and ask that he puts it up on our website. And then as always, if you have any questions, please don't hesitate to reach out. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you, Justin. All right, it's 2:54. We'll go ahead and take a break and resume back here at 3 o'clock for our next session, IDPH larvicide training. Okay, it is now 3:02, so we're gonna go ahead and get started with our next session. And I'd like to introduce Katie Nelson and Sam Davis with IDPH, and they're gonna be presenting on larvicide training. And I'll now turn it over to Katie and Sam.
All right, can you hear us okay?
Yes.
All right. All right, I'd like to start off by introducing myself. A lot of the people on this call I've known through my time at Will County Health Department, but I've been with Illinois Department of Public Health for about 3.5 years now. And most recently took the position as the supervisor of the Structural Pest and Arbor program. So I know for many years, for a lot of you at local health departments, it's been Barb and Sam. Now it's going to be Katie and Sam, which I don't know has the same ring to it. But I just wanted to start with that introduction and then a couple of updates that we have from central office. So as far as the fiscal year 23, the Comprehensive Health Protection Grant application is now available in eGrams, and this does include the vector surveillance grant. It is a 1-year grant agreement going from July 1st, 22 to June 30th, 23. So that submission deadline date is Saturday, April 30th by midnight. Also, we need to remind a lot of the locals out there that the NPDES pesticide permit did expire on October 31st. So everyone, if you have not done so already, will need to reapply for the NPDES this year. However, they haven't posted the new permit yet. So once that is in place, it'll be good for 5 years, and those applications can be filled out online. So if you do need any help with that, any additional info, or the link for the EPA's website to fill out your NOI, please feel free to reach out. As far as the 1 hour is concerned today, Sam will be providing that training. Keep in mind that this is for the application of solid larvicides only by the license holder. With this license, you cannot train others unless you're licensed by the Department of Agriculture as an applicator, which does require passing the general standards and mosquito exams. Within the presentation, Sam will provide a slide that will show the information that is required from every participant that does wish to get their license for the 1 hour training. Information that we will need will include your last name, your first name, your address, city, street, zip, telephone, date of birth, and employer. And that information can be emailed directly to Sam, and he will provide that contact information so we can submit your information in order for you to receive your license. Now, if there is any additional staff at your office, municipality, or summer interns that will require this training, please contact us. We'll be happy to go out and provide the 1 hour training. Or if you want to partner with any of the municipalities within your jurisdiction, we do presentations for that as well. With that, I will turn it over to Sam to start our training.
All right. Hello, everybody. This is Sam Davis. I've been doing this training for you for many years. I really enjoy it, and I would like to go ahead and get started. This is for the larvicide application training for solid materials that go into primarily catch basins and standing or stagnant water. And we're looking to control the Culex mosquito, primarily the one that carries West Nile virus in Illinois. And that's the one we're really looking for. This rule was put into place due to a public health emergency that started in 1999 and 2000. And we've been doing this application work with you allowing to do it with the 1 hour training since 2003. All right. Okay, so this is my email address and Katie's phone numbers here. If you really want to get a hold of me, the very best thing to call is call my cell and leave me a voicemail or a text message there. I will get back to you as soon as I can. I even look at it periodically, even during off days and things. If there's an emergency or something you really need to know, I'll try to reach out and respond to you. The next thing is that we're going to start with the licensure though. And the main thing is that you understand that it's only for larvicides and it's only single-use materials. That's probably the main thing we really want to do. You're licensed. You're like, okay, one more. Sorry, I'm not good with this PowerPoint stuff. I like doing it in person. So you're licensed by the Department of Agriculture through the Division of Natural Resources. There's their phone number. I really would like though to, before you contact them, if you have a problem regarding your license or us you receiving it, that you check with us first to make sure that everything's been filled out and I can show that it's been sent to them. I would be happy to reach out for you, but if you want to talk to them directly, you can go ahead and do that through that phone number. This was put into effect in 2003, basically due to the public health emergency we had from West Nile virus beginning in Illinois when we had a significant outbreak. At that time, Chicago had over 250,000 catch basins that needed application basically immediately, and they had no licensed people to do that. The Department of Agriculture rule is at that point you had to have a full agricultural license and a mosquito certificate to apply those materials. That really just wasn't feasible or workable. So for that process, we're allowed to do larviciding with just this 1 hour training, as long as we had trained people with the following things we're going to talk about here. And it was good only for 1 year. And if you do this training, you must redo it every year to make sure that you have your certificate up to date prior to starting. You do not have this in actuality. We always say to people during the trainings, we'd like you to have it early enough to where you have the certificate in hand. In the event you don't have the certificate in hand, but you've been trained through our department and you need the certificate or need to start at that time, give us a call, let us know, and we'll sort of let you know that it's a good process to go ahead and get started, and we'll work from there. But more than likely you'll have your certificate well before we'll really want you to start larviciding this year. The rule has been in effect since 2003, and it's only good for 1 year. And that's the main thing we really want to stress here. The minimum of 1 hour training is done by a licensed applicator. It can be done by any licensed applicator as long as they meet all the requirements of the training, which I cover here. You must include safe handling practices, a label review, and the methods of proper application. I've always said at some point, though, in reality, I could do this training in a minute and a half, but it really does require a full hour to make sure everything goes well. You pick up the material, you make sure when you drop it, it goes into the catch basin. If it misses the catch basin, just ensure that you have swept it in there appropriately so it's in the catch basin and not actively able to be picked up by a children or anything else. That really could conclude the training right there. Wash your hands, don't eat, drink, or smoke, or allow children to handle it during the process. That would really do everything else. But for everything else we do here, we always go through all the training and everything that's really important. It's a solid prepackaged material, and the only one you can use has a caution word on the label. I have not known of any that are restricted use currently at this time. This rule change was put in to cover only certain larvicides. I'll give you a list of those. As long as they're EPA approved for larval control and are a single-use application, they meet the requirements for this material. This must be licensed for this product and licensed to do mosquito control. Okay, with West Nile virus, we always look at that basically as you're looking at you're seeing very few cases of actually the cases that are in humans that cause the disease. You're looking at probably 80% of the people who get West Nile are completely asymptomatic. And that's what this concern is. So we're always missing so many cases. Most cases are mild, but all severe cases start out as mild cases. You get flu-like symptoms, minor aches and pains, a slightly elevated fever, and then with mild cases, that's pretty much what it goes into. Most people at this time do not generally seek medical care, even for West Nile fever. We have had the concern the last few years. I think we're missing very many of the milder and less severe cases, because if you call your doctor and you tell them you have a fever, flu-like symptoms, muscle aches, and you have a negative COVID test, they're going to tell you not to come home, not to go there, not to deal with it, just wait and get better, which in most cases you will. So you're going to miss a lot of these mild cases. And I think that's what's reflected in the numbers nationally. And a little bit of concern there is we're not really seeing the real effect of what West Nile is actually doing. So that's really where we're pretty much at. Mild cases are not generally reported, and we kind of talked about that. They're treated by a physician. There no confirmatory testing is usually done at this time. If it worsens, then you go under to confirmatory testing. And at that time, you really probably will end up, it is a reportable disease and it is identified. In most cases, it's identified as it's more severe and you've actually been hospitalized. Active cases, really, like we just talked about, are headaches, moderate to severe, flu-like symptoms, muscle ache, weakness, sometimes a trunk rash, sometimes not. These cases are generally determined by the treating physician, and especially if you're in an area where we're reporting that we have active West Nile activity related to positive birds, positive mosquito pools in those areas. It does give the physicians an opportunity to be somewhat aware of what's going on regarding that. Severe cases were in the same boat as the active cases, and you were a minor case, an active case, and now you're a severe case, and that's generally less than 1%. Is severe ocular headaches, usually where you get extreme pressure behind your eyes and makes it very difficult to focus. Severe muscle pain, paralysis, disorientation. Most people in this situation will be put under a respirator and can fall if they do not recover well. They will go into coma and death. Most severe cases are in the ages over 50, and when we really over the years and trending, it's really been into the 70s where we see the most debilitating cases. The sad thing about the West Nile virus is that not only are they debilitating, but for people who already have immunocompromised or already are elderly or in poor health, generally never recover back to where they were after having these cases. They always have ongoing health concerns and problems that were related to West Nile, and it's usually highly debilitating. Many people that end up with severe cases are really very disabled the rest of their lives. We talk about personal protection. I think it really includes a lot of different things. Mainly is that it's not just repellents. It's everything from checking your screens, making sure your doors fit well, making sure that when you're going in and out of the home, that you're not allowing mosquitoes access in. That the property that you have in any place around you, since these mosquitoes don't really fly very far in comparison to other mosquitoes, and they're not extremely hard or aggressive biters. If you remove standing water, drain your property and clean up any debris or tall weed growth or plant growth in those areas, it does actually help reduce your risk of getting West Nile virus. Empty any containers on a weekly basis. It takes more than a week for the larvae to develop if you dispose of the water that's around your property. It really will improve the risk of you increasing your mosquito population. Personal protection, we always say wear long sleeves, wear long pants, wear socks if you're outdoors along with your pants. They're really identified as ankle biting mosquitoes. If you use DEET, DEET or DEET at 20 or 30% applied to clothing or 10% less to kids works very well. The reason we always apply DEET at 20 or 30%, there are higher concentrations of DEET. 20 or 30% will last a full 8 hours before it needs reapplication. That's more than adequate for a normal workday. So you really should only apply it once. And if you apply it, you should never apply it only to your outer layer of clothing and skin, something you're not going to cover. You don't want to spray your t-shirt with it and then put on a raincoat or above it, because DEET changes properties when it can't off gas. It becomes a skin absorbent and can be toxic. The reason we apply for children at 10% and less is not only is it a really safe material, but children generally are not outdoors for more than 4 or 5 hours at a time, or when they will need to come in and can be reapplied to them at that time. DEET's much less toxic than many of the other materials we use, and is deemed to be really safe if it's used properly to label directions. But as we always say, read the label. There's also picaridin, oil of lemon eucalyptus, and PDM. These are all natural materials, I like to say. Natural does not always mean as less toxic. Lemon of eucalyptus is has a lower LD50 than DEET does substantially. And picaridin oil can be a skin absorbent if used improperly. So I always like to stress, just because it's a natural ingredient doesn't mean it's any less, it is more or less safe than an inorganic like DEET. Avoid outdoor activity at dusk and dawn. The Culex mosquito really is very active primarily at dusk or a little bit later, and is more active till about midnight or 1, and then it slows down. Then at dawn, it actually increases activity again. So if you're out at those times, it's really important to wear DEET. I can also stress too, if you're working outdoors and you're in areas that are heavily wooded, where it's shady and semi-humid and very cool, and you're under shrubbery or working around shrubbery, if you disturb Culex mosquitoes during the day and they are looking for a blood meal, they will take one during the day as well. Property control. Whenever you can remove any kind of trash that may hold water, everything from small cups to cans to jars to tires to kiddie pools, anything that will hold water that you can remove that is on your property definitely helps you with controlling mosquitoes. Cleaning out gutters and downspouts on buildings is very important. If the building is in full direct sun, no shade, and the water temperature in the gutters gets well over 120 degrees a day, and during the daytime, and it's extremely hot, you probably won't have mosquito activity in the gutters. But if it's on the back of a property where there's a lot of organic, where all of you've seen leaves and trees, little tree sprouts going out of your gutters and stuff, and you know they're full of standing water on an ongoing basis, and they're semi-shaded by something, you can get very quick turnover of mosquito larvae that are in there, and they can produce large amounts of mosquitoes even in very, very short periods of time, especially if they're in an ideal condition, like a very warm gutter on a building. Dump and cover all portable containers which hold water, and that's everything from boats to tires to anything in your yard that can hold water, and that's not a big amount of water. That's a very small amount of water, a quarter of an inch to a half an inch. And if it lasts for more than 10 days because it's being resourced, it definitely has the opportunity to produce mosquito larvae as long as it has some organic materials in it. If you have bird baths, we do encourage you to have them. We just ask that you refresh them on a weekly basis and dump the water out so that you cannot get larval growth in the bird baths. I think the biggest concern we had originally with this was that since birds are the host species for West Nile virus, meaning that the mosquito has to bite the bird to infect other mosquitoes to amplify the virus, there was a concern originally that the birds were the problem. They really aren't. It's just as long as you keep the bird baths clean, they're safe to come into your yard. There's no interaction between you and them. It's only if the mosquito bites an infected bird and then develops the virus that they can transmit later on to you. Maintain swimming pools and ponds. In the past, there were a lot of ponds that were not large ponds, but small backyard decorative ponds that people turned the pumps off on, or they fell out of disrepair, and they did produce a large amount of Culex mosquitoes very close to people on the property and where they maintain. Swimming pools are the same way. If your pool's chlorinated and cleaned and your filters are running, it's great. If it's not been maintained for multiple years and it's full of organic material, it is a potential risk to reproduce large numbers of Culex mosquitoes. Remove any old tires. Old tires are one of the probably like the ideal mosquito breeder if you wanted to build one. If you get some water in them, it'll actually stay in there. If it gets organic material in there, the water heats up during the day, condenses in the top of the tire, runs down. It stays since the tire collects during the day in the sun, it maintains its temperature overnight and causes the mosquitoes larvae to reproduce at a much greater rate than they would in the wild or in different containers. This was sort of, not to slam anybody, but this was from Dr. Haramis's group, that we identified vehicle bodies that were abandoned in the Peoria region, and he did find multiple chances of mosquitoes reproducing in those. I really don't see that much up here, but it is the opportunity that we kind of want to see. Anything that's old or not used and has opportunities to fill with water is a potential risk for Culex activity. Mosquito stages, what do they look like? They really are, then what a pupa look like? They really are these two guys right here. The pupa is a thin, straight thing having the head end is down. The breather is on their back end, it goes above the water. It's a small siphon. It draws air and then they drop down. Mosquito larvae are rarely this color for even a few minutes. They actually, as soon as they start to ingest organic material from the water they are in, they immediately turn a black to brown. Sometimes they're called wrigglers or wigglers, and you see them in the water and they're little threads, and they shoot around in the water and they'll dive. If you cast a shadow on water, they'll absolutely go to the bottom and try to avoid detection. The pupae are on the other side, and they are tumblers, and they're found anywhere there's no fish, no waves or current activity, because they need to bring that siphon up to hold the surface tension to have air. So when they have any of those things, they have the opportunity to get it. Fish eat substantial number of pupa and larvae when they're available, and most times mosquitoes will avoid placing their eggs where pupa and larvae have fish available, because they do have the opportunity to really have them eaten and to suppress their populations. Okay, so mosquitoes are a complete metamorphic cycle: egg, larva, pupa, and adult. The eggs are laid in a small raft for Culex mosquitoes. On other kinds of mosquitoes, they're laid on the soil and flushed into the water once it rains. For the Culex mosquito, there actually is an egg raft. The egg raft is a very brown, about the size of a sesame seed, sort of curved on the ends. And it's really very difficult to see, especially if it's in organic water and there's other materials on top of it. The eggs stay on the water for 2 to 3 days until they start to develop enough. Once they develop, they go into the water and they become larvae. This is their feeding. And this is why we always use larvicides for them, because this is their most active feeding stage. During the other processes of their life, they really don't eat very much. They will take nectar in as adults. Pupa do not eat at all. Larvae tend to eat organic material and microscopic organisms in the water, and they eat them at fairly large amounts, and they grow fairly quickly from the size of the eggs up to the larvae within 5 to 7 days from the time they hatch out of the eggs. And then they go on to pupa, where they're another 10 days. And then after that, the pupa develop. Once they've eaten enough, the pupa sort of a resting phase. They develop from the pupa, and then they raise up to the top of the water. They crack their outer shell of the pupa, and the mosquito floats up, rests with surface tension on the water, dries off, and then flies off and is ready actually to do a blood feed. And that process repeats. It takes between 14 and 20 days, depending on the light, but depending on how long the temperatures and water temperatures and organic material are available from egg to pupa and into an adult. So you got to kind of keep that in mind. You're looking at a really short time period here, probably about 2 weeks, maybe a little bit longer for a normal cycle. And it may drag on, or maybe a little bit shorter depending on temperatures. Approved larvicides. This is what we're really talking about, really, though. These are the things you really need after everything else is you need to make sure that you can use approved larvicides. Here's a list of them that we have, and I'll talk about each of them a little bit, but not a real lot. Altocid is an insect growth regulator, and the Altocid is an insect growth regulator, and what it does is it prevents them from developing from larvae through the pupa form and being able to hatch out. Altocid extended release briquettes are exactly the same material. They're just larger and last a longer period of time and are distributed into the water. Altocid is only needed to be in the water at about parts per billion. Altocid pellets are another one that we see. They come in a rice packet, and they're a wettable soluble packet, and most of these are pre-measured to use in catch basins. You got to remember that the Culex mosquito we're looking for are primarily in catch basins, stagnant standing water, and they're really different from the floodwater mosquitoes that you see 10 days or 15 days after a hard rain. These guys are a lot different, and the materials we use for them are very specific for them. Vectalex is a gut toxin, and Spiratex is a gut toxin. It comes in a wettable soluble packet also. They are little fine crystals. The packet is very susceptible to moisture. So if you have them, please keep them dry until you intend to use them, because they will disintegrate if you hold them in your hand very long or keep them in a wet condition. They will disintegrate, and the packet will disintegrate. So it's real important that you keep those dry. When the larvae of mosquitoes ingest those, they cause their gut to rupture, and they basically have looks like almost like a spike go through their midgut, causing their guts to rupture, and they die. The advantage of that is if you're using Vectalex or Spiritex, you do not see live mosquito larvae still in the water like you will with the insect growth regulators. Insect growth regulators do not kill the larvae. They just retard their growth and never allow them to fully develop as adults. Bactomos BTI briquettes, those are the ones that were most common for just over-the-counter sales. We don't see them as much anymore. They work about very similar to the Spiritex and Vectalex. It's just they're in a briquette form, and they usually float on top of the water and slowly release their material over a period of time. 4-star briquettes is a mixture of Bactomos briquettes and BTI, or Bacterius thuringiensis israelis. And what it does is it gets the ideal properties of both of them and becomes a little bit broader spectrum control for Culex larvae in the water. And that's why sometimes we use 4-star. Natural and Natural extended release are spinosad based. They're the similar material that you use for controlling rootworm in farming areas. And the one question with those is, the only thing I would advise you with those is if you're using Natural or XRT Natural, that you do rotate it periodically, because we have seen resistance in rootworms. We have not seen it in mosquito larvae yet, but we definitely don't want that to happen. So that's one of the reasons I strongly recommend that you rotate those products really between all of them, but Natural and the extended release and the 30-day is to rotate them among. Most of these products last, and you have to read the label, and this is what we're going to stress next, but you have to read the label to ensure that you're applying it properly. Review of labels. There's potential environmental hazards, understanding what the label restricts, what location they're allowed to be put in, what amount they're to be used, and how to store and dispose of them properly. The main thing we really want to talk about, though, is that the potential environmental hazards for these materials is extremely low, which is very good. They primarily solely affect mosquito larvae, black fly larvae, and don't really cross over and infect other insects, because the concentrations of the material we use is generally identified to control mosquito larvae and black fly larvae. The label is restricted to applying to areas that may or will become wet during the season, and the locations are fairly broad. Any place that will flood or may flood and last for more than 10 days, you can use this material on. We'd strongly suggest that you use it so that it's not accessible to children, as that says on the label. And the amount used is specifically on the label. Generally, though, since the prepackaged materials are uniquely designed for use in a catch basin, it's very important that you kind of use one per catch basin. And there's a few exceptions to that, depending if they're highly organic, but that's all specifically on each label. When you store them, always store them in a dry location, because they are susceptible to moisture and disposal. I strongly recommend that the materials do not deteriorate as quickly as their labels, not their label says, but as their data production says. They were still effective even after use. So with all structural pest controls, or all pesticides in general, you want to use your material up. You do not want to dispose of it into a landfill just because it's out of date. Just continue to use what you have in stock until you depleted your supply, maintaining your safety data sheet and your label to show that you purchased it when it was a legal and active product, and continue to use it. Don't get a huge amount for years over, but if it's over, even if it's over a little past its expiration date, it's still highly effective and still very useful. The manufacturer indicated to us that it's not really, it's just the manufacturer, this helps you keep your rotation in proper, so that you don't have a real old box that you leave out and you bring back in. Okay, questions on application. The Department of Agriculture is the governing body of this and makes all final decisions and interpretations of the law. I always like to stress this. Don't call me and ask me an opinion on a label. You need to ask the Department of Agriculture, and I would first ask the manufacturer to get an advisory on specific applications that you're unclear of or unfamiliar with, and they'll be more than happy to give you an indication. If you're not happy with that answer, please get a hold of the Department of Agriculture, because they are the licensing group. Here's a number for a pesticide hotline. It's down there on the bottom, and you can feel free to call that, and they can answer many questions you might have regarding any pesticide, little on just larvicides. Legal requirements. As FIFRA says, the label is the law. You must always apply materials directly as the label is directed. We also talked to you about this. Next thing is for Illinois and for other states, we need to have an NPDES permit or a notice of intent on file with IEPA prior to doing applications. There's currently no fees for this. It's a single form. It's relatively easy to fill out. If you have any questions, please contact me. I'll be more than happy to help you walk you through this and make sure that it's up to date. Many places, and the counties are handing out larvicide to municipalities, we strongly suggest that the county at least ensure that the municipality they're handing out to it has a valid NPDES and appropriate 1-hour larvicide training. That's always really good. There's no fee for it, but it's really a good practice. You are allowed to larvicide with this material, and I think we just want to make sure that we stress that even though you're allowed to larvicide, you are not allowed to adulticide. You may not spray for mosquitoes. You may not do anything regarding the single-use package with this application or single-use products. You can't, your supervisor can't give you a 5-gallon pail and tell you to scoop 2 ounces and put it in each catch basin. They have to go out and give you a prepackaged material so that it's safe and we know exactly how much has been applied. There's no reporting requirements to EPA or on the NPDES for small use larviciding applications, which all of you with this 1-hour larviciding will meet. The only way you would have to do any reporting to the EPA for your notice of intent or through IEPA is if we were applying large amounts, meaning in excess of, I think it's 250 or 300,000 catch basins per year, which none of you meet those requirements. City of Chicago is even below that currently. Application requirements. It's always advisable to ensure there are larvae present when you're applying a larvicide. The only exception to this is catch basins. Please, whatever you all are doing, do not open catch basins to look to see if there are larvae in them. It is a very dangerous process and can cause injury. It's always advisable that you just drop the packet in between the grate and ensure that it goes in, and make sure that if it doesn't go in, that you try again until you get it in between the grates and it does go down. Some of the very large ingots will not fit between the grates, and you have to put them in a way so that you don't damage them, because if you damage them, they release more material quickly and won't be as long as their 90-day application. Must be designated on the label. So any place where there's water or will be water is generally what it says on the label. And during the time period when you're doing your application, and that's some places you're allowed to apply, and it should last, and the water should be there present for more than 10 days so that we know we're actually involving the larvae in it so they will not reproduce as adults. Or a similar site. Then that's one of the things, like how to use a dipper. Hopefully for some places where you do have this opportunity, a dipper is a small little cup, primarily usually on the end of a stick, is an important tool if you're looking for larvae. But some areas that don't require dipping, really, this isn't important for. If you all are using dippers to see that larvae is present, especially in backwaters or where you have stagnant standing water that may not be very deep, but it's there for quite a bit of time. If you take your dipper, do not cast a shadow onto the water. I guarantee if you do, the larvae will see you coming and will hide and get out of your way, and you may not detect them. You take your dipper, you put it in away from you and slowly pull it up, turning it up, lifting it toward you with some organic material in it, and slowly start to decant it. If you see little wrigglers in there or little larvae, which you hopefully can't identify at that point, it's a good idea to do applications because you have a significant amount of mosquito larvae in there that you want to suppress so that it doesn't cause a problem in the area. Use a good flashlight on them. They're easier to see. If you shine the flashlight into the water you have in the dipper, they generally are very easy to see that if you've captured any and that you need to do your application. A good strong flashlight really always does help. If you have periods of time, especially in your communities where each year you have flooding or standing water, and you know that these are if you have a map of them, it's very helpful to know that you need to go back to those areas each year to look, because mosquito populations tend to work in the same areas year over year. They're very constant as to how and where they reproduce. It's required that you have a safety data sheet. You don't have to have it with you, but you should review it once a year. It contains health information on risk factors and effects of the material, first aid, fire protection, spill control, and toxicity, and disposal requirements for the material that you've received. The one thing I'd like to note about safety data sheets that come with your materials It's different than the label because the material they're reviewing on the safety data sheet is primarily the active ingredient only. So when they're talking about the LD50s and hazards on the safety data sheet, it is substantially less than actually the material you're handling. It's still present, but it's substantially less because your material that you're handling is much reduced in concentration over what the material on the safety data sheet is identifying. We always talk about toxicity with larvicides, and that means that in an LD50 is half the tested subjects in the population, whatever animal they're using or whatever pet insect they're using, that dies from ingesting material in so many milligrams per kilogram of body weight. Usually in most cases with the LD50s, they're using sensitive animals or animals that they've made uniquely sensitive to those materials. And so you're looking at materials that, for those materials we're using, they're relatively safe as reasonably possible. They're anything below a 5,000 LD50 or below a 5,000 LD50 is deemed to be toxic. Above that number, it doesn't have much of a risk. Even caffeine that you use, and that's not 1 cup of coffee, mind you, but 150 to 200 milligrams of coffee per kilogram of your body weight can be very toxic and be very dangerous. 30,000 milligrams of sugar ingested at one time, which is a lot. I really don't believe you could actually ingest that much at one setting, but I think some people may have tried. It is important that you take a look at that. The nicotine is very toxic. Altocid is 34,000. It is less toxic than sugar. BTI is about the same toxic as sugar. Even though they are that toxic, I do not recommend you ingest them at any time. One of the most toxic things right now in the United States is botulism toxin, which is at parts per billion in toxicity per milligram of body weight. This is a label. This is Altocid briquettes. Every label you get has a specific active ingredient. If you see it there on the top, and all of them that you're allowed to use have to be identified as a caution label. And that's the main thing, is that it's caution so that you have read the label and you understand it. In reality, there's so many materials that you use, excuse me, that I'm not going to read you each individual label. I don't think it benefits you, but before you use this material in the field, even if you've used it for years, please review the label at least once before you start and understand the application that you're using are on that label and that it meets those requirements. Read through the label. They're usually only a page or two, and they're pretty clear cut as to what they want you to do. There are relatively few environmental risks, but please review them for each material you use and to follow those label directions as directed. That saves me a lot of time. I think going over each label is redundant and not really necessary, since all of you may use different materials than what we were showing you here. As long as they're EPA approved and have a caution warning and are for mosquito control, you're free to use them in Illinois. A little technical here.
Moving a little too far. There you go.
Okay, we're back now. Sorry about that. The main thing we want to identify in this stage is for the size of the catch basins you use. We have some unique catch basins. Some are shoulderless, some are actually fairly deep. And you need to understand the water depth, and that's below the secondary pipe where the water discharges out. All catch basins are built with a catch underneath them or a sump underneath them so that any organic material that runs in off the street, rocks, dirt, debris, does not plug your pipe right away, and it builds up and makes a heavily organic material on the bottom. And this, in the depth of the, especially for Altosid, the depth of the water in those catch basins makes a huge difference as to how many you use. So if you have a normal catch basins in Illinois are in the 0 to 2 foot range of depth. That's generally 90% of them. There are a few exceptions in older areas that are heavily treed. Some of them are actually fairly deep, and we have identified those on the north side of Chicago and in some of the northern suburbs where they had a lot of elms and oak trees at one time that developed a lot of leaves into the thing, and they didn't clean them out as well. And they are 2 to 4 feet deep, and some of them are actually 4 to 6 feet deep. You need to know that if you're in areas that are not relatively new construction areas, where almost all the new ones are 0 to 2 feet deep. Just so know that for your application and how many you need to do per thing. Some suppliers that we have, there's quite a few of them throughout the United States. Illinois. One thing I can tell you is all these are great suppliers. I had very little problem with any of them. The interesting thing is though, all the prices are exactly the same. The materials, the manufacturers who supply larvicides are under a no compete contract, and all of them are required to be sold at the same price. So keep that in mind. Feel free to find who out has the best supply and the people you are most happy with, but all of them are relatively going to sell you the larvicides at the same price. General questions on mosquitoes, West Nile virus, and applications. I feel free to take them, or we can write them up at the end, but we're going to hold them to the end if you don't mind, because that'll help us a little bit right now get through our presentation. I want you to go through. Here's what the information I need for your certificate to be sent to you. Your last name, your first name, your address, your city, state, zip, phone number, date of birth, and employer. If you send that to me at sam.davis@illinois.gov, I will compile all the information I need and submit it to the Department of Agriculture so you'll get your license. Give it at least 3 weeks or so by the time I get everything applied and put in, and then I will, hopefully you'll have it in a week or two after that. So you should, but from this date on though, as far as we're concerned, you can apply larvicides. We strongly recommend that you don't apply larvicides in your catch basins till at the very last week of May, 1st of June, because we want to try to get in that situation where we're getting mosquitoes that are fairly active, and after some of the hard rains we get in May and early June that generally flush out the catch basins and cause your materials to move and become not really highly effective. Now we're back to our presentation. I'd like to talk to basically right now in Illinois about what happened last year, what cases we had. For our years, we've been a relatively low amount of cases. They were primarily in Cook and DuPage County throughout the entire state. We had 61 total cases that were identified, most of them being some fevers, most seriously more elderly people and more severe disease were identified. I think a lot of this has to do with the COVID outbreak, along with still depressing our numbers. But nationally, they were also depressed, almost very similar to what we've seen in the past too. Nationwide, the cases were pretty much spread out. But when you really look at them, they were in Arizona and California, and the rest of the cases were relatively small and relatively weaker in number than we've seen in the past. But of all the cases we had last year, we had 2,695. Nationally, we had 2,695 cases. Arizona in 2 counties, really in 2 counties, but primarily in 1 county, had 1,645 cases of all the national cases were identified in 1 state. You must remember though, from the earlier part, that's only 20% of probably the total number of cases that were available, because very few of those cases were actually identified, and actually even less than that, because most of the cases that are identified are even more severe than the mild cases of West Nile virus. So Arizona had a significant epidemic outbreak last year, substantially higher than what we've seen in the past. And Colorado had 174, California 115, Nebraska 107, we were at 61. And that was what every place looked like but that Arizona. So we know that if you in periodic times, this is an endemic virus now that we see all the time in Illinois every year. And by you helping suppress it, we keep these numbers relatively low. And then periodically, if your suppression is weak or they have a lot of dry down, which Arizona had last year, and a lot of their irrigation ditches had large amounts of Culex tarsalis, and they are a little heavier flyers than the Culex pipiens we have here, and they have an absolute opportunity to spread. And it also concentrated birds to drink water into those drainage, into their irrigation ditches, and you had a combination of birds and infected mosquitoes in one location that distributed into that county and region, causing a substantial number of cases and causing an epidemic outbreak. West Nile is really identified as an endemic disease now, with epidemic outbreaks that are, if without surveillance and suppression, really have the opportunity to really get out of hand really quick. In 2012, if you remember some of my older presentations, Dallas, Fort Worth, and Texas had almost over 8,000 human cases that were at least, if not that, and 340 deaths. So the opportunity there in Texas at that point was really significant back then. So we do have these epidemic outbreaks throughout the United States. And that's why good treatment and suppression that we're having you do with larvicides really does help. And this is just the death rate. The death rate is generally related to about less than 5% or 1 to 5% of the population that gets it, depending on their age and disability. Arizona had 112 last year. California had 11. Colorado had 8, and Nebraska had 9. Those were our high groups in the state nationally that had it. You've got to remember, though, that Texas in 2012 had over 283 deaths related to West Nile virus in one county. California, these are the most active cases by state that I kind of picked out the big ones right off, but California had 6,500, Colorado had 800, Texas had 5,400 of them. Nebraska had 3,700. Illinois, we've had one high year where we had 2,458 cases. South Dakota, even with a population of only the size of Cook, not even the size of DuPage County, with their about 1 million people, had 2,400 cases in 1 year. I did not take into account how much the population is versus the actual numbers. North and South Dakota are significantly high risk for West Nile virus in periodic years when they're active. There's a bunch of different kinds of mosquitoes. Primarily where we have the Culex pipiens, and I'm going to go through it a little bit, but there's 3 basically strong species. Excuse me. We have Culex pipiens, Culex sartalis, and Culex quinx or quinctiferosus, and they're in the southern part of the United States. All of them are very, very similar. And if I'm going to go on to the next slide, that's what they look like. And as best everyone else can tell, they look identical. They have small genetic traits and a small tarsal on the Culex tarsalis on its back leg that identifies it as that mosquito. Their habits are pretty much the same. Culex tarsalis is a little bit harder flyer than the other two and has the opportunity to spread the virus more quickly. And when you have those combinations of what I showed you, where their locations are, any place that they intersect where you have multiple species like Culex tarsalis and Culex pipiens in the same location, you have a significant potential risk for greater outbreaks in certain years just due to the opportunity of the feeding opportunity of these mosquitoes. That pretty much concluded our presentation on West Nile virus. Keep your questions, keep your thoughts. But one of the things we are talking about now is with our program is we're beginning to look more at tick-borne diseases in the United States. We have quite a few, and we have a lot of potential. They're very hard to identify, and you see, but we are beginning to see more and more of them. Lyme disease, I think, is probably the one that you hear about the most. Rocky Mountain spotted fever is not really related to the Rocky Mountains. It's throughout the United States. Other spotted fevers along with it, Escherichiasis, Anaphylaxis, Babiosis, Starrii, Powassan, Tularemia, and a bunch of other ones are all transmitted by ticks to humans. They're all transmitted at relatively low levels. The only potential risk they have is that they are hard to detect, and they can have very debilitating effects on people who get them. The tick that carries Lyme disease is the black-legged tick, and that's the one that's on the Midwest and all along the East and West Coast. They are the ones that are primarily identified with Lyme disease. Their nymphs and their larvae carry it as well as their adults. So it's very important that if you get ticks on you, that you remove them properly and promptly. We can talk about that a little bit. If you get a tick on you, you definitely do not want to grab it by the tail in there, behind its legs, and pull on its body, because the head is where the virus is identified and into the palps is where it injects. So if you tear the body off and you don't remove the head, the virus, the palps, and the body will continue to work as if it has that blood collection sac on it or not. And it can, the quicker you get a tick off, and not in the minutes, but if you can get it off in a day or so after it's implanted, it's a substantially less risk of you catching Lyme disease by removing it promptly and safely. I always talk about safe removal. It's best done with a tweezers, put it around the head on both sides and sliding it down in close to your skin as possible, putting pressure on the head and slowly shaking it back and forth until the tick, because of its size, will release. And when you get it released, please take a look that you have the head and the palps, and those are the two little, look like pincers that stick off the front of its face, that you have both those things with you, that you remove the tick successfully. Then you can destroy it any way you want. They are not easily killed just by smashing. You almost have to cut them up to get them to make sure they're dead. So I do advise that if you're doing that, or drop them into alcohol for a period of time. American dog tick is probably the most common, and it's one we see throughout Illinois and most of the Midwest and northern states. They have become substantially more common in the last few years than they were 20 years ago. It's a lot to do with temperature, weather conditions, and that people are in areas where dog ticks used to didn't be, and now they are, and you see them advancing into suburban and even urban areas where you find them now. They like to rest on vegetation. Tall vegetation seems to encourage them from actively getting onto you or collecting you. As you walk by long vegetation, as you brush up against it, the tick will jump from you to your clothing and then try to implant. Brown ticks are almost identical to dog ticks, except for that U shape around their shoulders, and they're nationally and also carry most of the diseases that dog ticks carry. Dog ticks do not carry Lyme, and brown ticks do not carry Lyme, but they do carry Rocky Mountain spotted fever, the spotted fevers, and many of the other diseases that we see in humans. The Lone Star tick has developed in the last few years, and it's one that does carry disease also in Illinois, and has been moving up substantially to where its range a few years ago was not into the Chicago metropolitan area, but now it is found periodically here, and you need to take a hard look for it. It looks so much like a deer tick that you need to get yourself familiar with this. And as we go on, I think in the years to come, I think you'll see more and more information about ticks. Ticks have one disadvantage, though, is that the diseases they carry are widely underreported. In Wisconsin, this is just the best example I can get. These were ticks removed from deer that were at hunting stations. So when you brought your deer in for the game warden to check, or to check off that you had got your deer, they would periodically spray them and collect the ticks off of the bodies. And the ticks that were identified on the bodies in those darkened areas, the darkest areas, substantial numbers of that they removed from those deers were positive for Lyme disease in those areas. And that's what a great concern is you're seeing this advance in this disease throughout the upper Midwest, and it's all moving farther south into Illinois and other locations farther south. Rocky Mountain spotted fever is another disease. We don't see that many. We see between 5 and 19 a year in Illinois. It is where it's transmitted here. It is present. It's at a low level. The concern is that it's carried by the dog tick and the brown tick, and the opportunity for you to come in contact with it is greatly increased. Most people that get it may or may not develop significant symptoms, but the risk is when you do, you become highly feverish, and you need to be treated with antiviral treatments from a physician if you get it. The other concern we have about ticks is it's not like mosquitoes where they're fairly in a population. They're in pockets, but they're still fairly active in wide areas. They're somewhat randomly spread throughout a region, depending on the foliage, the temperature, how much safe work you do. Do you trim your grass back? Do you have nothing around the bottom of your bushes? As we build homes into forested areas or into wild wetlands or wildlands that weren't recently habitated, the opportunity for the tick to become a bigger problem is concerned. There's always, and lately there have been identifying multiple new diseases related to ticks. We've had one called a Bourbon virus, which is from Bourbon, Kansas County, and we have one that causes you actually to have reactions to ingesting meat proteins and cause you to have a severe anaphylactic reaction. And so there's a lot of things going on out there that we're just learning in the public health, and we're kind of developing a look to see if what we can do to help control them. Right now, currently, there's very limited methods of controlling ticks in a safe and effective manner for the environment. And it's just a good process to make sure that you reduce your vegetation that is long or high standing where ticks have an opportunity to treat, and to make sure that everything's cleaned up, and that you take a good process on looking at protecting yourself by wearing DEET or other applications. Okay. Okay. These are the last of the slides I really have, though. This was something we did look at. We're always concerned about things that are up and coming. I think these are ones that the public health service within the United States and worldwide actually missed. 1957 and 68, we had Hong flu. 1976, we had a St. Louis outbreak that was unidentified until it was well underway. An avian flu outbreak, an H1N1, was identified in 1997, and West Nile virus in 99, until it got to the United States, was pretty much unknown. We had COVID very recently, and we knew all that went, and we don't really know what else is out there, but we really want to concern ourselves with making sure that CDC is funded well. In 2019, their budget was cut by about $595 million, and that did right before our funding. In actuality, though, CDC in 2019, 2020, for fiscal year 2020, did receive $12 billion in funding just for COVID response, not for all the programs, but just for their end of the COVID response. So we know we can throw money at things, but on the year over year, it's really important to make sure that we do that. The final thought I really have is right now we're currently having an outbreak of Asian flu in an avian strain, not significant right now to transmitting human to human, but it has that potential. And right now it's currently in more of an economic concern than it's been in the past. And it was first identified in, it's really under the radar. It can be virulent, and it can modify. And that's one of the concerns we have. It's currently present in poultry farms in Iowa, Kentucky, Missouri, and is continuing to spread. So what we've learned is that you really need to keep aware of things like this that you hear in the news, or what is reported that there's a potential risk. All right, and I am pretty much squared away. If anybody would like any comments or anything, we'd feel free to answer them. But I think we've concluded. Make sure you get your data to me, and I'll be more than happy to ensure that you receive your certificates. If you don't, please email me, and I'll be more than happy to help you with that. Thank you very much. Any questions, anybody?
Looks like earlier we had a question. What if we submitted last year but have not received our new NPDES? I applied in March 2021.
Okay, you should probably if you can send me that information, we can probably look it up for you. We're more than happy to do that. I don't have control of that organization, and I really don't know if they're getting them all back to everybody. If they're, especially, was it a renewal?
Doesn't say. I'm not sure if Melissa's still on.
I am still on.
Oh, there she is.
I can email it to you from last year.
Why don't you do that, and I'll see if I can find out your information for you and get back to you. How about
Right.
that?
Thank you.
All right. Is there anything else? Or are we pretty much squared away? It's a little after 4 o'clock. I want to get everybody out of here and have a great holiday. Have a great day. What? Wait, found one. Well, go ahead. Is that information on larvicides is the question? It's good for about 5 years past is what we generally have identified also. That's pretty accurate.
Like that's all the questions we had. I think Justin was going to wrap it up.
Okay, great. Well, thank you so much for your time, and good mosquito protection this year, and I hope you have a great season. Goodbye.
All right, thank you to all of our speakers today. That concludes the spring virtual conference put on by IEHA. Please make sure that you send those forms, the CU form, to the email address. I do want to add one comment. If you do know that you have issues with Gmail account or things like that to your health department email address, please either provide an alternate email address or use an alternate email address to make sure that you receive these forms in a timely manner. Hope everyone enjoyed the conference, and we'll hopefully see everyone at the AEC in November. Thank you.